Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let's begin. Story 1. The Ragged Schools Where the Poor Learn to Read. Imagine the streets of London in 1830, not the elegant promenades of Mayfair, but the cramped alleyways of Whitechapel, where soot clings to the bricks and barefoot children dodge between horses' hooves. The scent of boiled bones, coal smoke, and refuse floats in the air. Here, childhood was not a protected phase of life, it was a race to survive. In this world, education was a luxury. School was something you might have heard about in a sermon or seen through the window of a wealthier child's home. But for most working-class and impoverished children, reading and writing were as distant as the stars. Most would be sweeping streets, minding younger siblings, or selling matches before they ever saw a chalkboard. The education desert. Before the 1870 Education Act, which made elementary education compulsory in England and Wales, schooling was neither free nor broadly available. The so-called dame schools offered some semblance of instruction, often held in the front rooms of elderly women's homes, but these varied wildly in quality. Many children learned nothing more than how to keep quiet and sit still. There were also charity schools for the deserving poor, often founded by religious organizations. But these came with strings, religious attendance, rigid discipline, and scrutiny of the child's moral character. These schools could only serve a fraction of the growing underclass produced by rapid urbanization and industrialization. Thousands were left without any formal learning. The dirty truth. Victorian cities were breeding grounds for poverty and crime. The Industrial Revolution had drawn families into urban centers in search of work, but cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and London lacked infrastructure for the influx. Children as young as 5 labored in factories, cleaned chimneys, or scavenged through rubbish heaps. At night, many slept in doorways or crowded tenements where disease ran rampant. Literacy was low by 1841. Estimates suggest that 50% of men and nearly 70% of women in England couldn't read or write. Without education, children became trapped in a cycle of poverty, unable to access even the lowest rungs of the emerging middle class. Enter the ragged schools. In this bleak context, a group of idealistic reformers and volunteers began to take action. The earliest ragged schools were informal spaces, often just basements or stables, where destitute children could learn basic literacy, arithmetic, and Christian values. They earned the name ragged because of the condition of the students who attended unwashed, shoeless, and dressed in rags. These schools were free and open to all, a revolutionary concept in a society still clinging to ideas of moral worth and class hierarchy. Their founders believed education was not just a privilege but a necessity even for the poor, especially for the poor. John Pounds, the cobbler who taught. One of the earliest pioneers was John Pounds, a humble Portsmouth cobbler who began teaching local street children in his tiny shop in the 1810s. With no government support and little formal training, he crammed up to 40 children into his workshop, instructing them in reading and writing while he repaired shoes. Pounds offered more than just education. He fed the children, gave them clothing, and tended to their minor injuries. His model became a symbol of selfless charity. Though he never called it a ragged school, his work inspired others to follow suit. When he died in 1839, his story gained traction among religious and philanthropic circles, spreading the idea that education could be a moral mission, one focused not on punishment or doctrine, but uplift. Thomas Guthrie and the Scottish Push. While Pounds operated quietly in England, Dr. Thomas Guthrie, a Scottish minister, took up the cause in Edinburgh. He published pamphlets like a plea for ragged schools, urging the government and society to see that ignorance was the mother of crime and education its remedy. Guthrie's schools aimed to provide food, clothing, and vocational training, along with reading and religious instruction. He wasn't just advocating for knowledge, he wanted to mold children into productive, law-abiding citizens. The ragged school movement became, in his hands, both charitable and practical. His argument wasn't sentimental. Guthrie made a case for national self-interest. Uneducated children would become criminals, a drain on public funds. But with schooling, they might become servants, soldiers, or laborers useful to the empire. The Ragged School Union. The real turning point came in 1844 with the formation of the Ragged School Union in London. Led by Lord Shaftesbury, a peer known for championing social causes, the Union sought to bring coherence and support to the scattered efforts across Britain. By 1870, over 300 ragged schools had been established, serving more than 300,000 children. Classes were typically held in evenings or on weekends to accommodate children who still worked during the day. Meals were provided, often the only hot food the child would have all week. The schools weren't perfect. Many were overcrowded and underfunded. Discipline could be harsh, and the emphasis on religious instruction sometimes crowded out more secular learning. Yet, they represented one of the first mass educational efforts aimed at the urban poor. A school without shoes. Life in a ragged school was both bleak and hopeful. Children arrived without shoes, hair matted with lice and stomachs rumbling. Lessons began with prayers and a stern lecture on cleanliness. Slates were handed out. The teacher, often a volunteer, would drill students on the alphabet or simple sums. There were no uniforms, no textbooks, and few desks. The room smelled of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Yet within these walls, a child could learn to spell their name, to count change, to recite a hymn. In a society that had long treated them as disposable, they were being acknowledged, if only for a few hours a week, as humans with minds worth tending. Why they came. Why would a child, bone-tired after a 12-hour shift in a factory, bother with a school that offered no certificate, no guarantee of advancement? Because it offered something else: dignity. In the ragged schools, they were not thieves, vagrants, or beggars. They were students, and that small shift being seen not as a problem but as a person had profound psychological weight. There are records of children walking several miles to attend classes. Some came just for the soup, others for the warmth. But many stayed because learning offered an escape, even if only in their minds. Beyond the blackboard. While education was the stated mission, the schools became centers of community support. Some operated soup kitchens. Others offered job placements or apprenticeships. A few even provided beds for homeless boys. Inspectors in the 1850s noted that ragged schools had a measurable impact on reducing juvenile crime in their neighborhoods. Girls who had been scavenging or prostituting were taught sewing and laundry work. Boys were sent to work on farms or with tradesmen. The education may have been basic, but the real lesson was more subversive. Even the poorest child deserved attention, guidance, and care. But not everyone approved. The ragged school movement was not without critics. Some viewed it as a breeding ground for dissent, teaching the lower classes to read radical pamphlets or challenge authority. Others feared that feeding and clothing the poor would make them dependent and lazy. Even within the movement, disagreements arose. Should the focus be religious or practical? Should the goal be salvation or employability? Was it enough to teach children to read, or did they need to be taught how to live? Still, the schools persisted, sometimes for decades, changing one life at a time. And yet, even as the ragged schools spread, they were always meant to be a temporary solution, a patch, until something more permanent could be built. But how did this improvised effort among cobblers and clerics evolve into a national educational system? The ragged schools began as an act of desperation and decency, a voluntary patch on a system that didn't care whether the poor could read. But by the 1860s, the questions they raised were becoming harder to ignore. If children needed education to escape poverty, shouldn't that education be a right, not a privilege offered by well-meaning volunteers? In this section, we follow how the concept of education for the working poor evolved from charitable endeavor to state responsibility. We look at how pressure mounted from reformers, inspectors, and even the children themselves to make schooling not only available but mandatory. The problem of the unteachable child. One of the earliest criticisms faced by ragged schools came from those who argued that the children they served were simply too far gone. Descriptions of the time show a tendency to dehumanize them. Urchins, gutter snipes, the dangerous classes. Teachers reported that many of their students didn't know how to sit still, couldn't hold a pencil, and didn't respond to gentle instruction. One reformer likened teaching these children to building houses in sand. But it didn't take long to see change. Given structure, some food, and even the most rudimentary instruction, children adapted. They showed resilience. Over time, the notion that the poor were uneducable began to fade. It was a crucial psychological shift. If these children could learn, the real question became, why weren't they being taught? Inspecting the impact. By the 1850s, the ragged school union had grown large enough to attract government attention. Parliamentary commissions began to visit the schools, sending inspectors to observe lessons, question students, and assess outcomes. Reports were mixed. Some schools were praised for their dedication, others were condemned for overcrowding and undertraining. But one finding stood out. Even the poorest children, those living on the streets or working full-time, did benefit from education. The model was crude but effective. Government figures began to appear in debates. Crime was down in neighborhoods with ragged schools. Juvenile arrests declined. Some graduates even found work as clerks, porters, or servants, a sign that the system could lift children beyond their origins. The Industrial Schools Act, 1857. As the success of ragged schools became harder to ignore, Parliament moved cautiously toward a more institutionalized solution. The Industrial Schools Act of 1857 allowed magistrates to send neglected or delinquent children to residential schools where they would receive training and basic education. These were not intended to be kind places. Industrial schools functioned more like reformatories than educational institutions. Children were often housed in strict, prison-like environments and subjected to manual labor alongside their lessons. Still, they offered food, shelter, and a break from the street. Some ragged schools transitioned into industrial schools or partnered with them. This shift marked an uneasy alliance between charity and state power. Education was being used not just to uplift, but to control. The role of the church. Throughout this evolution, religious organizations remained deeply embedded in education. The Church of England, in particular, ran many of the nation's voluntary schools, emphasizing moral instruction over academic rigor. Ragged schools were largely evangelical in origin, with strong support from Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists. For many reformers, education was a form of salvation literally. Reading scripture, memorizing hymns, and confessing sin were seen as integral to becoming a good citizen. But as the idea of universal education took root, tensions arose. Should schools be places of spiritual guidance or neutral, state-run centers of learning? Could the two coexist? These questions were debated in Parliament, in the press, and in the pulpits. As secular voices grew louder, the model of the ragged school, while respected, began to feel outdated. The push for universal education. In the 1860s, public pressure began to mount for a more comprehensive approach to schooling. Reformers, journalists, and politicians pointed out that Britain lagged behind other nations in literacy and numeracy. Prussia had implemented compulsory schooling in the early 1800s. France was expanding its education system. The U.S. had already passed laws requiring schooling in several states. Why was the world's most powerful empire failing to educate its own? Lord Shaftesbury, once a champion of ragged schools, now argued that voluntary efforts could only go so far. The state had to step in. He wasn't alone. A new generation of reformers wanted to see education treated as infrastructure, not charity. The Elementary Education Act, 1870. The tipping point came in 1870 with the passage of the Elementary Education Act, commonly known as Forster's Education Act. It did not make schooling compulsory. That would come later, but it laid the groundwork for a national education system. The act established school boards in areas where existing voluntary schools couldn't meet demand. These boards were empowered to build new schools, funded by local taxes. Importantly, the schools were to be non-denominational, though Bible reading was still permitted. The act also required all children between the ages of 5 and 13 to attend school if a place was available and their parents could afford the fees. The system wasn't truly free, and enforcement was weak. But it represented a seismic shift. The state now acknowledged that education was not just a social good, but a government responsibility. The ragged school movement declines. With the rise of board schools, the ragged school model began to fade. Its strengths, flexibility, informality, moral mission became liabilities in a more standardized system. Some ragged schools closed entirely. Others were absorbed into the new national system. A few continued as night schools or Sunday schools, focusing on older children or adults. By 1881, school attendance was made compulsory for children up to the age of 10, raised to 12 in 1899, and local authorities were expected to enforce it. The ragged schools, once pioneers, had become relics. But their legacy endured. The very idea that poor children deserved education without payment, without proving their moral worth, had been radical in the 1840s. By the 1880s, it was law. What was gained, what was lost? The transition from voluntary to compulsory schooling brought many improvements: standardized curriculums, better trained teachers, and broader access. But it also introduced rigidity. Where ragged schools had sometimes tailored lessons to individual children teaching older girls sewing, or boys carpentry, the board schools aimed for uniformity. Children were sorted by age and ability. Failure to comply meant fines for parents and, in some cases, punishment for the child. The personal touch faded. The soup was no longer served. The stories of rescued waifs and cobbler teachers were replaced by inspectors' reports and attendance registers. In trying to build something that worked for everyone, the system sometimes forgot the lessons learned on the margins. That education is not only about information, it's about care, attention, and dignity. Lives changed. Many ragged school graduates went on to lead modest, respectable lives. A few rose to prominence. One became a member of parliament. Another founded a charity of his own. Countless others simply survived escaping lives of destitution because someone had taught them to read. A former student of the Field Lane Ragged School wrote decades later that learning to spell his name was the proudest moment of his life. He was 8 years old, and no one had ever asked him his name before. These stories remind us that education is not just a path to employment or social mobility. It is a recognition of personhood. And in Victorian Britain, that recognition often began in a cramped basement, with a broken slate and a borrowed pencil. And yet, even as the movement wound down, its story was not entirely over. One final chapter remained. What happened to the buildings, the teachers, and the children when the state took over? Did the spirit of the ragged schools live on in the new system, or did it vanish entirely beneath bureaucracy? The ragged schools may have faded into the pages of history, overtaken by government mandates and national systems, but their impact did not disappear. They left behind more than buildings or educational models. They left behind ideas. Ideas about childhood, poverty, responsibility, and the right to learn. In this final section, we explore what happened to the people and places that made the ragged schools possible, how the model influenced later educational reforms, and how echoes of their work can still be felt today. We close the story by asking whether the spirit of the ragged school, a deeply human, hands-on response to suffering, has survived in a modern world increasingly managed by systems. Left behind. When the state assumed the responsibility of educating its youngest citizens, it did so with structure, authority, and funding. In many ways, this was progress, but the transition was not seamless. Hundreds of ragged schools were shuttered or absorbed into the new board school system. Some were demolished, others lingered on as charity centers or youth clubs. A few struggled to adapt, converting into night schools for working teens, or vocational centers teaching skills to older boys and girls. But the golden age of volunteer-run free education was over. Those who had staffed the ragged schools, often untrained, unpaid, and unrelenting in their mission, faced a difficult choice. Some went on to become certified teachers. Others joined newly formed school boards or charitable organizations, but many, aging and weary, stepped aside. For the children who had once learned their letters in church basements or stables, life after the ragged school was mixed. Some moved seamlessly into the board schools and thrived. Others dropped out when fees, uniforms, or distance proved too great a barrier. And others still fell through the cracks, too old, too poor, or too damaged to be absorbed into the new order. Traces in the curriculum. Though the new state-run schools had little interest in replicating the informal methods of the ragged schools, certain ideas filtered through. First, the concept of education as a tool of social reform, once radical, was now foundational. Education wasn't just about letters and numbers. It was about shaping behavior, creating citizens, and preventing crime. In this way, the state adopted the moral imperative long championed by ragged school reformers. Second, the role of the teacher as moral guide persisted. While the newer system trained teachers formally, the expectation remained that they would impart not just knowledge but values. Many of the earliest board schools continued to include religious instruction, morning prayers, and strict discipline, echoing their charitable predecessors. Third, the idea of supportive education, providing meals, shoes, or clothing to the poorest students, remained, at least in some areas. Though the state was slow to accept responsibility for children's material needs, the precedent set by ragged schools made it increasingly difficult to ignore. A world beyond the blackboards. Some of the most innovative legacies of the ragged school movement lay outside of classrooms entirely. One was the creation of home visiting programs, where educators or volunteers visited families to assess living conditions and encourage school attendance. This model eventually inspired elements of modern social work. Another was the expansion of youth clubs, libraries, and vocational training centers. These developed from the understanding honed in the ragged schools that children needed more than just books. They needed places to go, activities to engage in, and adults who paid attention. The Field Lane School in London, for example, eventually became a boys' home and workshop, offering room, board, and apprenticeships to orphaned and abandoned youth. In Manchester, a former ragged school was converted into a recreation center for working children, offering music, exercise, and moral lectures. In these spaces, education was still present, but so was something deeper: community, protection, and a fragile sense of belonging. The names that faded. Curiously, many of the pioneers of the ragged school movement are now little known. John Pounds, the cobbler who started it all, has a statue in Portsmouth and a handful of churches named in his honor. But beyond that, he's rarely discussed in classrooms. Lord Shaftesbury is remembered as a social reformer, though often without detailed reference to his educational work. Thomas Guthrie, who was once a household name in Scotland, has faded from public memory. Yet each of these figures helped shape a system that now seems inevitable. Free education, widely available, and grounded in the belief that every child deserves a chance. Their invisibility is not a sign of failure. Rather, it is a mark of success. Their ideas have become embedded, so deeply embedded, in fact, that we no longer question them. They are part of the furniture of modern life. Not quite forgotten. Some institutions have kept the memory of the Ragged Schools alive. In London, the Ragged School Museum stands in a former school building in Mile End, offering visitors a glimpse into what a Victorian classroom for the poor would have looked like: long wooden benches, slates instead of notebooks, and iron stoves for warmth. There, you can read the handwritten registers listing the names of students who once scavenged coal from the docks or slept in railway arches. You can see the photographs taken by reformers' boys in caps, girls in threadbare pinafores, all facing forward, hands in laps, trying hard not to fidget. Their names are mostly forgotten, their stories rarely told, but in that silence lies the weight of their survival. The modern equivalent. In many ways, the problems the Ragged Schools were created to address have never fully disappeared. Across the globe, millions of children still lack access to free and meaningful education. Others attend school but remain hungry, unsupported, or unsafe. The debates of the 19th century continue today. What is the purpose of school? Who is responsible for a child's welfare? How do we measure success? Is education a right, a privilege, or a tool of economic policy? In recent years, new versions of the Ragged School idea have emerged. In refugee camps, urban slums, and conflict zones, volunteers still gather children for informal lessons. They teach without pay in makeshift classrooms, using whatever materials they have on hand. Some of them, though they may never have heard of John Pounds, are part of his lineage. Why it still matters. So why does this story matter now, in a world of digital classrooms, standardized testing, and national curricula? Because it reminds us what education is and what it is. The Ragged Schools didn't offer grades or exams. They didn't produce high test scores or world-class scholars, but they did something quieter, something foundational. They noticed children who were otherwise invisible. They took those children seriously. They offered knowledge, yes, but also structure, dignity, and time. They offered attention, and in that act of attention, lives were changed. That principle that seeing a child is the beginning of teaching them may be the most enduring lesson the Ragged Schools left behind. A return to the beginning. Imagine again the streets of Victorian London. The fog settles low. A boy, no more than 8, sells matches near a lamppost. His coat is too thin, his face smeared with soot. He is invisible to most. But a woman stops, asks his name, tells him there's a school not far where he can come tonight. He hesitates but follows. The school is small, crowded. The teacher is tired, but the boy is handed a slate. He writes his name. He is fed a bowl of thin soup. He is told he matters. He may never write a novel. He may never own land. But tonight he learns to read the word hope. The buildings are mostly gone. The teachers long buried. But the questions the Ragged Schools asked still echo. What do we owe the children we do not see? Story 2. Factory boys and chimney sweeps work before play. Before the playgrounds, before the schoolyards, before childhood was a time of learning, and laughter it was labor. If you were a child in Victorian Britain and you weren't wealthy, your earliest memories were likely filled with the sounds of machinery, the scratch of soot, or the press of heavy loads. Childhood, as we now understand it, simply didn't exist. This section explores the grueling reality of working-class childhood in the 19th century, especially the lives of factory boys and chimney sweeps. These children weren't seen as developing minds or delicate bodies. They were useful because they were small. A time without aid. In early 19th century Britain, childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was not organized by school terms, birthdays, or developmental milestones. There was no universally agreed upon point when a child stopped being a toddler and started being a worker. For the poor, the moment of transition came with necessity. A father injured on the docks, a mother widowed, a family falling behind on rent. When there were mouths to feed, even a 6-year-old could become a source of income. Children entered the workforce for one reason: survival. The industrial appetite for smallness. The Industrial Revolution created a new economy, a machine-powered world of mass production that needed laborers who were cheap, fast, and adaptable. And there were few laborers more adaptable than children. Factories, textile mills, matchstick plants, iron foundries demanded workers with nimble fingers to untangle threads, remove cotton waste, or clean machinery. Children were prized not in spite of their small size but because of it. Mill owners found that young workers could crawl beneath the spinning mules, sweep out lint from beneath looms, and reach into spaces too narrow for adults. They were less likely to unionize, less likely to complain, and far easier to discipline. In some towns, children made up more than 50% of the factory workforce. A day in the mill. Imagine the life of a boy named Samuel, age 8, in Manchester, 1842. He wakes before dawn. His home is a crowded tenement, a single room shared with 6 siblings. Breakfast, if it comes, is a crust of bread. He walks to the textile mill, arriving by 6:00 a.m. He's what's known as a piecer. His job is to lean into the machinery and retie broken threads on the spinning frames. The work is constant. The machines never stop. The factory is deafening, the air thick with dust and cotton fibers. There are no breaks, except a short pause for lunch. If Samuel slows down or makes a mistake, he might be beaten with a leather strap or fined part of his already meager wage. He finishes at 7:00 p.m. He walks home in darkness, exhausted, ears ringing, fingers raw. He is paid just a few pence. And then he wakes and does it again. The chimney boys climb. Factory work was brutal, but chimney sweeping added another dimension: danger. In 18th and early 19th century England, every house had a chimney, sometimes several. The flues were narrow, twisting, and easily clogged. A clean chimney meant less smoke, better heating, and lower risk of fire. But who could fit inside such a narrow shaft? Enter the chimney boy. Often as young as 5 or 6, these children were apprenticed to master sweeps. In practice, this meant they were often bought, orphaned, or taken from poorhouses. Their job: climb into dark, soot-filled flues with nothing but a brush, scraper, or sometimes just their bare hands and knees. They were given little food, cold water baths, and sleeping quarters in cellars. Injuries were common. So was suffocation. In many homes, the soot-stained boy climbing out of the fireplace was simply part of the daily routine. The real price of soot. The physical toll on chimney sweeps was devastating. Climbing caused severe abrasions on knees and elbows. The soot lodged in their lungs. A unique cancer, chimney sweeps carcinoma, a form of scrotal cancer, was first diagnosed in these boys, caused by prolonged exposure to soot against bare skin. Some boys were burned alive when household fires were relit too early. Others suffocated, trapped in bends in the chimney with no way to escape. Their masters sometimes lit small fires beneath them, so-called encouragement fires, to force them upward. The public was not entirely blind to this suffering, but the work continued, largely unchecked, for decades. A nation begins to notice. By the 1830s, the plight of working children was drawing growing concern from reformers, doctors, and clergy. One of the most vocal was Lord Ashley, later known as Lord Shaftesbury, who campaigned tirelessly for child labor laws. In 1833, the first Factory Act limited working hours for children under 13 to 8 hours a day and required 2 hours of schooling. It was a start, but enforcement was weak. Mill owners circumvented it by forging age records or bribing inspectors. In 1840, the Children's Employment Commission was formed. Its findings were damning. First-hand testimonies revealed 6-year-olds working 14-hour days, children beaten for falling asleep, and mill girls crippled by long hours standing on hard stone floors. Public opinion began to shift, but not quickly. The language of work and blame. Even reformers struggled with the language they used to describe child workers. They spoke of children being rescued, reclaimed, or redeemed. These terms reveal how deeply embedded the idea was that working-class children were somehow naturally degraded or fallen. Poor children were not viewed as innocents in need of nurture, but as potential threats to social order, lazy, unruly, prone to crime. Work, it was thought, kept them out of trouble. If that work was dangerous, well, it was better than begging. The logic was circular. Children had to work to survive. Working made them appear older than their years, and their roughness, in turn, justified more labor and less sympathy. Master sweeps and apprenticeships. For chimney sweeps, reform came even more slowly. The first Chimney Sweepers Act, passed in 1788, was nearly toothless. It set a minimum age of 8 for apprentices, but included no enforcement mechanism. It was widely ignored. More acts followed, each slightly stricter, but children continued to be exploited well into the late 19th century. It wasn't until the 1875 Chimney Sweepers Act that the hearing of child sweeps was effectively outlawed, and licensing was required for adult sweepers. In the meantime, many boys died in flues. Others grew up permanently deformed by years of crawling through soot. A few escaped the trade, often with help from charities or religious groups, but most simply grew too big and were discarded. A child's wage. What did these children earn for their labor? Very little. In many cases, children's wages were paid directly to their parents or guardians. In factories, they might earn 3 to 5 shillings per week. Chimney boys often received no wage at all, just food and lodging, which was little better than neglect. Yet this income, small as it was vital to poor families. Removing a child from work often meant the difference between subsistence and starvation. This made reform difficult. Parents weren't always villains, they were survivors in a harsh economic system. The working child's voice. One of the great absences in Victorian labor reform literature is the voice of the children themselves. Adults debated, legislated, and moralized, but rarely listened. A rare exception is found in the testimony gathered by the 1842 Royal Commission. A 10-year-old boy described how he had to run from wheel to wheel in a mill, catching stray bits of yarn. "If you trip, it can cut your leg off," he said simply. "They beat you if you're slow." Another, aged 9, said, "I don't know what school is. I heard of it, but I never saw one." These voices, though fragmentary, are haunting. They are not heroic, not dramatic, just tired, matter of fact, as though the idea of rest, of play, of a different kind of childhood was something they couldn't quite picture. Work before play. In the Victorian imagination, work came before play. Childhood was a phase to be endured, not celebrated. Games were rare, leisure discouraged, laughter suspect. Only gradually, through decades of activism, legislation, and cultural change, did this view begin to shift. As compulsory education spread, as child labor laws grew stronger, and as society began to imagine a child as a mind to be nurtured rather than a body to be used, the world began to change. But the scars of the working child's world remain visible in archives, in photographs, and in the bones of old tenements. And so we ask, When society finally began to reconsider the place of children, what changed first? Was it the laws, the economics, or was it something else, an idea perhaps that children were not tools but people? By the mid-19th century, the plight of working children had begun to capture more than passing attention. Politicians, clergy, social reformers, and writers increasingly took up the cause, not necessarily out of sentimentality, but because the image of small, soot-streaked bodies crawling through chimneys or catching threads under spinning looms had become too grotesque to ignore. Still, reform moved slowly. The wheels of Victorian legislation turned not with compassion, but with cautious pragmatism. In this section, we explore how the movement to protect working children took root, what obstacles it faced, and how slowly the idea of childhood as a time for growth, not labor, emerged into law. Parliament takes notice. By the 1830s and 1840s, waves of public inquiry were underway. The Factory Commission, followed by the Children's Employment Commission, began gathering data across the country, sending investigators into mills, mines, and workshops. They spoke to child workers, factory owners, parents, and clergy. The resulting reports were grim and exhaustive. Children reported starting work as early as 5:00 a.m., collapsing from fatigue, or suffering injury from unguarded machinery. Some children had never been to school, others couldn't read their own names. Entire families were dependent on the earnings of a single small child. In one famous instance, a 7-year-old girl was found working 16-hour days plucking feathers in an unlit attic, with no breaks but a single crust of bread. These were not sentimental documents. They were dry, bureaucratic, and dense, but they helped shape public discourse. For the first time, the conditions of the working child had entered the parliamentary record. The Factory Acts, a patchwork approach. Early reform efforts came in the form of Factory Acts, piecemeal laws intended to regulate specific industries. The first notable one was the 1833 Factory Act, which prohibited children under 9 from working in textile mills, limited the workday of children aged 13 to 8 hours, required at least 2 hours of schooling per day, established a system of factory inspectors. But the act applied only to the textile industry. It did nothing for children working in mines, brickyards, glassworks, or as chimney sweeps. Enforcement was inconsistent. Inspectors were too few. Employers falsified ages. Some parents lied to keep their children employed. Others simply shifted children into unregulated trades. Reform created a squeeze, but the demand for child labor remained. Subsequent acts in 1844, 1847 known as the 10 Hours Act, and 1850 added new limits and closed loopholes. But progress was frustratingly slow, and change often came with compromise. Each gain for children's welfare was negotiated against industry's desire to maintain profits. Shaftesbury, the reluctant champion. At the heart of child labor reform stood one of the Victorian era's most persistent reformers, Anthony Ashley Cooper, better known as Lord Shaftesbury. An aristocrat by birth, Shaftesbury became the moral conscience of Parliament. He championed the rights of lunatics, minors, and factory children. Unlike many of his peers, he saw child labor not as inevitable but as a national disgrace. He worked tirelessly to push reforms through Parliament, presenting the testimonies of children, speaking at public rallies, and organizing religious support. His speeches were filled with biblical references and appeals to Christian duty. To Shaftesbury, childhood was sacred, and its corruption through labor was a sin against nature and God. Charles Dickens and the power of the pen. If Shaftesbury gave child labor a political voice, Charles Dickens gave it a human face. In novels like Oliver Twist, Hard Times, and David Copperfield, Dickens depicted children swept up in poverty, workhouses, and factories. Though fictional, these portrayals resonated with reality. His characters were composites of the children readers saw in the streets. Dickens had lived it himself. At age 12, his father was sent to debtor's prison, and young Charles was forced to work in a blacking factory gluing labels to bottles for 10 hours a day. He never forgot the humiliation. Through his stories, he made readers feel what statistics could not: the terror of being small, alone, and expendable in a system that treated children as cheap labor. Dickens didn't just tell stories, he advocated. He visited ragged schools, funded charities, and campaigned for reform. His writing became a weapon, wielded with empathy and outrage. Schools or sweatshops? The growing awareness of child labor's horrors led to a key debate. What was the alternative? If children could not work, should they go to school? And who would pay for it? The 1870 Elementary Education Act was a watershed moment. It didn't abolish child labor, but it created a counterweight: the expectation that children should also attend school. Under the act, school boards were established. Attendance became compulsory for children aged 5 to 13 at least when schools were available. The law allowed for exemptions for working children if their labor was deemed necessary. Unsurprisingly, exemptions were widely used. It wasn't until the 1880s and 1890s that attendance laws were more strictly enforced, and even then, rural areas and poorer districts often lagged behind. Children continued to work part-time, rise early for jobs before school, or drop out entirely by age 10. Education was coming, but work still ruled many young lives. Resistance from within. Not everyone welcomed reform. Factory owners warned of economic collapse. Some argued that shorter hours for children would reduce family income and drive adults to unemployment. Parents, too, were divided. Some supported schooling, others feared the loss of vital income. A day in the classroom meant one less loaf of bread on the table. Others distrusted the schools themselves. What would they teach? Would they discipline the child correctly? Would they challenge religious beliefs? Many working-class parents had never attended school themselves. They viewed it with suspicion. This tension made enforcement delicate. Policemen might be sent to knock on doors to find truants. Parents could be fined or jailed. In a few cases, children were taken from families deemed neglectful, a move that provoked outrage. Reformers had to walk a fine line between advocacy and intrusion. The end of the chimney boy. Among the last holdouts of traditional child labor were the chimney sweeps. Despite decades of public disgust and legislative effort, the use of child sweeps continued into the 1860s and beyond. It wasn't until 1875, almost 100 years after the first Chimney Sweepers Act, that the profession was finally regulated with teeth. The new act required all chimney sweeps to be licensed, banned the employment of children under 16 in climbing chimneys, allowed police to enforce the law and prosecute violations. It was a long-awaited victory. Campaigners like George Brewster himself, a former sweep who died at age 11, had become martyrs in the public eye. Even after the ban, stories of illegal child sweeping persisted, but the tide had turned. Technology had improved. Long brushes and vacuum tools made human climbers obsolete. Public sentiment had hardened. The chimney child, once as common as the lamplighter or fishmonger, disappeared from the streets. The cultural shift. By the 1890s, the idea of the working child was no longer normalized. A new vision of childhood, one marked by innocence, dependency, and potential, had emerged. Middle and upper-class families increasingly kept their children in school longer. Childhood was romanticized in literature and art. The child became a symbol of the future, of moral worth, of national strength. Even working-class families began to adopt the notion that schooling, while a temporary economic burden, might pay off in the long term. Factories began to rely more on adult labor. Laws slowly expanded to cover more industries, reduce allowable hours, and raise the minimum working age. Child labor did not vanish overnight, but its days as a social norm were ending. Memory and myth. Today, it's easy to view Victorian child labor as a grim but distant chapter, but its legacy is more complicated. Many of the systems we now take for granted, public education, child welfare laws, juvenile courts, grew directly from efforts to combat child labor. So too did the idea that the state bears responsibility for the well-being of its youngest citizens. That principle is now foundational, but it wasn't always. The movement to protect working children also reminds us that progress is rarely linear. It's piecemeal, contested, and often slow. It takes time for public morality to shift, for empathy to outpace economics. What changed the world? We often credit laws and politicians for societal change, and certainly, the Factory Acts and Education Acts were crucial. But beneath them were quieter forces. Testimonies: children who told their stories to strangers with notebooks. Teachers who took in children too poor to pay, too tired to sit still. Writers like Dickens, who used fiction to expose fact. Volunteers who offered slates and soup in basements. Parents who, when given the choice, sent their children to school instead of the mill. Change didn't come only from the top. It came from pressure from below. The machines kept running, the soot still stained bricks, but the idea of what a child was had changed. And that shift, once started, would prove difficult to reverse. But still we wonder, even after all this reform, what did the first generation of freed children become? Did they fare better than their parents? Or did poverty simply reshape itself into new forms? By the late 19th century, the wheels of reform had reshaped the Victorian world, at least on paper. The long-held belief that poor children were simply small workers, natural laborers, was beginning to crumble. Schoolhouses dotted the urban landscape. Factory inspectors filed regular reports. Chimneys were cleaned by tools, not children. But the story doesn't end with a law passed or a child removed from a loom. The aftermath matters too. What became of the children after work was taken from their hands? What filled the gap when labor was no longer their identity? In this final section, we'll explore how the end of widespread child labor didn't just change children's lives, it changed society's understanding of childhood itself. The first freed generation. The children born in the 1880s and 1890s were among the first in Britain to grow up under laws that limited their labor and encouraged or required their schooling. They were the first to live with a degree of legal protection, however imperfect. They still worked, of course. Many delivered newspapers before dawn, helped with laundry, sold flowers, or took part-time jobs in shops. But for many, labor no longer defined their entire existence. In a way, they were pioneers not just of modern childhood, but of its meaning. This was a generation that slowly began to expect to go to school, to learn letters, to play, to have a future beyond the factory floor. And with that expectation, society began to reimagine what a child was. From worker to symbol. In earlier centuries, children had been portrayed in art and literature as miniature adults, stoic, silent, even solemn. But the Victorian shift saw the rise of a different archetype, the innocent child. Painters like John Everett Millais began to depict children in domestic or pastoral settings, girls with dolls, boys at play, rosy-cheeked toddlers reading by candlelight. Literature followed suit. From Alice in Wonderland, 1865, to The Water Bobbies, 1863, the child became a protagonist of dreams, curiosity, and transformation. Even Queen Victoria, who bore 9 children, projected the royal family as a model of warm domesticity. Her public image with children gathered around, doting mother at the center, helped reinforce the idea that childhood was a space to be nurtured. This cultural shift was no accident. It was a response, in part, to what had come before. The figure of the chimney sweep or factory boy lingered in memory, a symbol of industrial cruelty. To counter that, the child was recast as precious. School as a new kind of work. While school may have freed children from the physical toll of labor, it did not free them from structure or discipline. Victorian schools were rigid and moralistic. Classrooms were often overcrowded. Corporal punishment was common. Children sat in silence, recited passages, and memorized facts by rote. But compared to millwork or soot-choked chimneys, school was a reprieve. It was also aspirational. For many working-class families, sending a child to school, even if it meant financial strain, was an investment in the future. A literate son might become a clerk. A well-behaved daughter might become a governess. Education was a ladder, narrow and steep, but real. Charities stepped in to provide uniforms, books, and food. The school meals program, started in 1906, recognized that a hungry child couldn't learn. Bit by bit, the state began to support not just the schooling of children but their bodies too. The role of play. As children spent more time outside of labor, society began to consider, what should children do with that time? The answer increasingly was play. In earlier decades, games were seen as distractions at best and sinful indulgences at worst. But reformers like Friedrich Froebel, the inventor of the kindergarten, emphasized the role of play in moral and intellectual development. By the end of the 19th century, playgrounds began to appear in urban areas. Parks installed swings, slides, and merry-go-rounds. Toy companies flourished, producing building blocks, dolls, and model trains. Even educational toys were promoted, teaching letters, numbers, or geography through games. The idea that play could be productive fit neatly into Victorian values. For chimney boys and factory girls of earlier decades, such leisure had been unimaginable. Now, it was becoming a right, if not for all children, then for many. What about the poor? Of course, these changes did not reach everyone equally. In the poorest neighborhoods of London, Manchester, and Glasgow, children still slipped through the cracks. They might attend school irregularly, skip classes to sell flowers or coal, or care for younger siblings while parents worked. Some families resented the state's intrusion. Others simply couldn't afford for a child to be idle. And yet, even in these areas, the idea of childhood as something separate from labor had begun to take hold. Teachers and inspectors noted that even part-time attendance created progress. Reading and writing were seen less as luxuries and more as necessities. The working child had not disappeared, but the working-only child, the child for whom labor was the whole of life, was fading. The chimney boy in memory. The chimney sweep became, over time, a figure of folklore rather than fact. He appeared in nursery rhymes, sentimental paintings, and eventually even musicals, often as a symbol of plucky resilience. By the 20th century, many Britons looked back on child labor with horror and pity. School textbooks condemned it. Statues and plaques honored reformers like Shaftesbury. Films and plays depicted the suffering of young workers to ensure it was not forgotten. But this memory was often selective. It focused on the extremes: the soot-covered orphan, the crushed factory child, while ignoring the millions who worked more mundane, invisible jobs. It told a story of rescue, not survival. The real lives of working children were more complex, often a mixture of hardship, pride, fear, and endurance. Lessons not fully learned. Even as Britain celebrated the end of child labor at home, it exported industrialization abroad. In colonies and trade networks, child labor remained common and largely unregulated. And even within Britain, children continued to work under informal arrangements. A 12-year-old might do errands for a butcher that amounted to full-time delivery. A girl might help her mother with laundry or sewing that was technically wage earning. The line between helping at home and working remained blurred. Meanwhile, debates about child labor took on new forms. Was a child actor being exploited? What about a child working in agriculture during summer months or in family businesses? The question was no longer should children work, but what kind of work is acceptable? Modern echoes. In many parts of the world, child labor remains a grim reality. Fields, factories, and mines still employ children today, often without regulation or recourse. In that sense, the Victorian battle is not over, but relocated. Even in wealthier countries, debates continue about child modeling, social media influence, sports training, and screen labor. Children now work through algorithms and audiences, not looms or chimneys, but the core questions remain. Who benefits from a child's labor? Who decides what is safe, acceptable, or exploitative? And what does society owe its children in return? These questions were asked in Parliament in the 1830s. They are still being asked now. A new kind of childhood. The slow end of child labor in Victorian Britain did more than create safer jobs or better schools. It invented something fundamentally new: childhood as an idea. A space between infancy and adulthood, marked by learning, play, protection, and possibility. A stage not just of biological development, but of social investment. This idea reshaped not only education and labor law, but psychology, parenting, medicine, marketing, and literature. It also shifted how adults viewed themselves. For perhaps the first time in history, large numbers of people began to look back and think, when I was a child. Childhood became not only a time of life, but a part of identity. Looking back, the boys who once climbed flues or tied threads in textile mills are long gone. Most never told their stories, but their legacy remains in the school bell, the playground swing, the right to rest and read and grow. They were the generation that made possible everything we now expect childhood to be. They did not choose that role, they simply endured, but through their endurance a society changed. And so we are left with a final question, perhaps the most difficult of all. If it took so much suffering to create the modern idea of childhood, how will we protect it now that we have it? Story 3. The rise of the pram motherhood on wheels. In today's parks and sidewalks, the image of a parent pushing a baby in a stroller is unremarkable. It's ordinary, expected. But in Victorian Britain, that image was new, even radical. The pram or perambulator did more than carry infants. It represented a turning point in how society imagined mothers, mobility, and modern childhood. This section explores how a humble wheeled cart became a symbol of care, class, and control. A time before wheels. Before the pram, bobbies were carried or left behind. For centuries, infants were swaddled tightly and strapped to their mother's body, or placed in stationary cradles while older siblings or neighbors watched them. Poor mothers who worked in fields or factories often had no choice but to leave their infants in the care of older children or even tethered to posts inside the home. There were no infant car seats, no nannies with pushchairs, no smooth strolls in leafy lanes. The baby stayed where it was placed. Among the upper classes, nurses, sometimes called nannies or wet nurses, carried infants in arms or in horse-drawn carriages, but these were reserved for the elite. The idea of everyday mobility with a child simply didn't exist. The invention of the perambulator. That began to change in the 1830s. The earliest known pram, credited to architect William Kent in the 1730s, was actually made for the Duke of Devonshire's children. It resembled a small, ornate cart that was pulled by a goat or pony, not something meant for public sidewalks. But it wasn't until the Victorian era, around the 1850s, that perambulators began to be manufactured and marketed on a broader scale. These early models were elaborate and upright, with wicker baskets and large spoked wheels, often resembling miniature carriages. By the 1860s, Prams were appearing in advertisements aimed at middle-class mothers. Their features included padded interiors, folding canopies, and eventually braking systems. But even at this stage, they were expensive, heavy, and symbolic. A symbol of respectability. The perambulator quickly became a marker of status. A mother pushing a pram was not just out for fresh air, she was seen to be mothering properly, publicly, respectably. In Victorian Britain, parenting was increasingly performative. A woman's moral worth was tied to her domestic role. The pram allowed her to take that role outside, displaying care and attentiveness in the growing urban environment. The pram also allowed for visibility of the child itself, something that hadn't always been valued. In earlier eras, infants were often considered too fragile to show off. The death rate for children under 5 remained high well into the mid-1800s. Some families hesitated to grow attached or to display attachment too early. But with declining mortality rates and rising ideas of sentimental childhood, bobbies became people to be seen and admired. The pram helped that happen. Urban planning meets parenthood. The rise of the pram coincided with another Victorian phenomenon, the public park. Throughout the 19th century, cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham invested in green spaces for recreation, health, and moral improvement. These parks, such as Hyde Park or Victoria Park, featured wide, gravel paths, shady trees, and open fields. They were ideal for perambulation. Middle and upper-class mothers took to these spaces with their prams, walking in slow, looping circuits. Nurses in uniform pushed carriages while children in starched collars toddled behind. Here, the pram was more than transportation, it was a tool of surveillance and social standing. Women watched one another. Nannies were judged on their posture, their treatment of the child, even the condition of the pram itself. Heavy, high, and hierarchical. Early perambulators were not easy to manage. They were tall and cumbersome. Some stood 4 feet high. The wheels were large and wooden with iron rims. Turning corners was difficult. Braking was often manual. Navigating uneven city streets or narrow hallways required strength and patience. Only certain households had the space and the servants to accommodate such contraptions. As a result, the pram remained a largely middle and upper-class item for decades. Working-class mothers, especially those who lived in cramped housing or worked long hours, couldn't afford or store them. Many still carried their children in slings or left them at home with older siblings or neighbors. In this way, the pram became a symbol of who had the luxury to parent in public. The gendering of motion. There was something else curious about the pram. It was almost always pushed by women. In a society where men moved freely riding horses, driving carriages, walking to business, women's mobility was more constrained. The perambulator offered one of the few socially acceptable reasons for a woman to be out and about alone. It gave her a presence in the public sphere, but it also defined that presence. She wasn't walking for pleasure or business, she was walking because she was a mother. She was attached, literally and symbolically, to a child. This tethering of women's movement to motherhood would persist well into the 20th century, and it began, in part, with the rise of the pram. Marketing the modern mother. By the 1870s, pram manufacturers began advertising directly to women. Ads appeared in women's magazines and catalogs like the Lady's Pictorial and the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine. These ads emphasized elegance, safety, and health. They used language like perfect for the infant constitution or ideal for park promenades. Some even claimed their design could improve the child's posture or digestion. Prams were sold as tools for scientific motherhood, part of a growing movement that applied medical and moral language to parenting. A good mother, it was implied, would invest in a proper perambulator. Even Queen Victoria got involved. Photographs of the royal family with perambulators helped popularize the trend among the middle class. If the queen pushed her children in a pram, then surely it was the modern thing to do. Safety or the illusion of it? Not all prams were created equal. Some early models were known to tip over easily. Others lacked adequate support for the baby's back or neck. Accidents were common. Still, the illusion of safety mattered. The pram offered a sense of control, of containment. The child was strapped, swaddled, and wheeled under watchful eyes. In a world increasingly aware of germs, dangers, and moral decay, this sense of enclosure was comforting. Parents were told to keep infants out of the cold, away from sick children, off of dirty floors. The pram offered all that and more. It was clean, elevated, and mobile. It was not just a piece of furniture, it was a protective shell. The rise of the pram walk. By the late Victorian era, a new ritual had emerged, the daily pram walk. Nurses were instructed to take infants out for a set period each day, rain or shine. Doctors endorsed the practice as essential to healthy development. Exposure to fresh air, they believed, strengthened the lungs, improved appetite, and prevented illness. This routine became part of the fabric of upper and middle-class domestic life. It was predictable, reassuring. Even when nothing else in the household went right, the baby's walk must happen. In this way, the pram helped structure time, creating order around infant care. It also reinforced a growing view of children not as passive beings, but as organisms to be managed, fed, cleaned, stimulated, and paraded, all according to modern science. Exclusion on wheels. Despite its popularity, the pram remained out of reach for many. In the slums of East London or the back alleys of Liverpool, working mothers watched the pram become a symbol of what they could not provide. Charity drives sometimes offered second-hand prams to poor families, but these were rare and often viewed as gifts for the deserving poor, those deemed morally upright and industrious. The lack of prams meant some mothers simply didn't leave the house. Others carried infants in arms while juggling shopping or laundry. Still others left bobbies alone during work hours, leading to tragic accidents or arrests. The perambulator, for all its practicality, also drew a line between the mothers who could display their care and those who couldn't. A moving nursery. In time, the pram came to represent more than parenting. It became a mobile nursery, an extension of the Victorian home. Some models featured fold-out sunshades, storage compartments, and even bottle holders. Others had musical chimes or rattles built into the sides. Manufacturers promised that a child could sleep soundly for hours inside, rocked gently as the wheels moved. Mothers and nurses were encouraged to think of the pram as a safe space, a substitute cradle, always within reach. This gave rise to the idea that infants needed less handling, not more. Modern parenting experts now debate this view. Some argue that over-reliance on prams contributed to emotional detachment and reduced physical contact. Others defend it as practical and liberating. In either case, the pram shaped how infants were touched, seen, and loved. From goat cart to global standard. By the end of the 19th century, the perambulator was a fixture of city life. British prams were exported across the empire. Colonies in India, Australia, and Africa saw women British and local pushing bobbies in European-style carriages. The pram became a visual shorthand for modern motherhood, and like many such symbols, it masked inequalities beneath its polished surfaces. Even today, the kind of stroller a parent uses can signal income, values, and even identity. The ghost of the Victorian pram remains not just in shape, but in symbolism. And so we arrive at a simple, a wheeled basket, and find it laden with meaning. But what happened next? As cities expanded, cars appeared, and science advanced, how did the pram evolve to meet the demands of the 20th century? As the 20th century dawned, the perambulator, once a status symbol of the Victorian elite, had begun its slow, rattling journey into the mainstream. The heavy, ornate prams of mid-century were evolving. Streets were being redesigned, cities expanding, and ideas of parenting, health, and modernity were changing. And with every shift came a new version of the pram, adapted for the times. In this section, we explore how the pram entered the 20th century, how design evolved to meet new social needs, and how this rolling nursery both reflected and influenced the transformation of parenting, gender roles, and urban life. A new century, a new child. The early 1900s were a time of immense transition. Public health campaigns flourished. Scientific parenting advice was booming. Cities were growing, and along with them, concerns about childhood development, disease prevention, and domestic hygiene. The child was no longer just a future worker or social symbol, it was a project, something to be cultivated, protected, and improved. Enter the modern pram, no longer just a means to move bobbies, but a tool for raising them. The rise of the baby carriage. By the 1910s, perambulators began to look more familiar. Designers introduced rubber tires, lower frames, collapsible parts, and better suspension. Prams became slightly lighter, though still bulky by today's standards, and more maneuverable. The term baby carriage started to take hold in the United States, while in Britain, pram remained dominant. Both referred to the same essential object, a wheeled, often cushioned, mobile cot. Advertising followed these changes closely. Manufacturers emphasized comfort and health, smooth rides, clean interiors, insect netting, adjustable canopies for sun or rain. There was an almost medical obsession with protecting the infant body from shock, wind, dust, and noise. The baby carriage was now part medical device, part moral accessory. War, women, and wheels. World War I disrupted production of many consumer goods, including prams. Metal was diverted for weapons, and working-class families tightened household spending. Many bobbies were carried in arms again, or placed in homemade carts. But the war had another effect. It changed women's roles. With men off at the front, women entered factories, offices, and hospitals in unprecedented numbers. This shift didn't erase domestic responsibilities, it doubled them. Women were expected to work and mother, to maintain patriotism and productivity. After the war, pram designs adapted to this new female mobility. More collapsible models were introduced. Some could be lifted onto trains or trolleys. Women pushed them while shopping, visiting friends, or walking to workplaces that allowed children to accompany them. The pram was no longer a static promenade tool. It was a rolling companion for modern urban life. Public spaces, private worlds. As more mothers entered public life with their children in tow, the pram became a way to create privacy in public. Its hood could be lowered for visibility or raised to create a cocoon. Curtains or nets shielded the child from prying eyes or bad weather. A sleeping infant inside a pram gave the mother a temporary reprieve, a moment to sit, read, or simply breathe. This privacy had social consequences. For some, the pram allowed working-class mothers a dignity once reserved for the elite. It created space literally for caregiving in public. But it also served as a kind of mobile judgment. A shabby pram implied poor parenting. A dirty blanket, an unwashed baby, or a child without shoes all became visible through the frame of the carriage. Parks, sidewalks, and waiting rooms turned into quiet theaters of maternal surveillance, and the pram was the stage. The pram goes modern. In the 1920s and 30s, prams embraced modernist design. Lines became sleeker. Materials shifted to lightweight metals and waterproof fabrics. Wheels grew smaller, allowing for tighter turns and smoother rides. Some prams even resembled automobiles. One popular model, the Silver Cross, featured white rubber tires, glossy lacquered sides, and suspension so refined it was advertised as gliding on air. It became the choice of royalty and affluent families. The middle classes followed suit. Retailers offered layaway plans. Department stores carried multiple models. The pram, once a bespoke item, was now mass-produced and branded. Mothers didn't just push their children, they pushed products. Maternal identity on wheels. The pram wasn't just a tool, it was a prop, one that helped define what kind of mother you were. Did you have a utilitarian model or a fashionable one? Did you keep it pristine? Did you park it by the tea shop or outside a factory? The physical act of pushing a pram began to be associated with specific types of femininity: graceful, dutiful, modern. A woman pushing a child in a well-kept pram became the visual shorthand for responsible motherhood. This had both empowering and limiting effects. On one hand, the pram helped normalize female presence in public life. On the other, it reinforced the idea that a woman's primary role, even when outside the home, was caregiving. The pram culture of interwar Britain. In interwar Britain, the pram took on new cultural significance. It became a symbol of hope, stability, and continuity in the face of economic depression and political uncertainty. Newspapers featured pram parades. Competitions were held for the best-dressed baby or most elegant pram. Mothers joined clubs and met for strolls through parks and squares, sharing tips on feeding, teething, and sleep schedules. Even popular music picked up the trend. Songs like Pushin', My Baby in the Park celebrated parenthood as a wholesome, aspirational ideal. At the same time, child-rearing advice became increasingly medicalized. Manuals urged mothers to monitor sleeping hours, feeding intervals, and hygiene. The pram became central to these routines: nap time, sun time, fresh air time. It wasn't just a stroller, it was part of the system. The hidden labor. All of this movement came at a cost, often invisible. Prams were still heavy, most lacked modern brakes. They had to be pushed, lifted, folded, and cleaned, tasks usually left to mothers or nannies. Public transit rarely accommodated them. Stores weren't designed with them in mind. Streets weren't always paved. Pushing a pram could be an act of dignity, but it could also be an act of endurance. Mothers balanced bags on the handles. Children clung to the sides. Rain made pushing harder. Hills were a nightmare. And woe to the woman whose pram broke a wheel or lost its hood. The pram helped liberate women, but also reminded them, every day, of the physical and emotional work they carried. The working-class baby on the move. By the 1940s, prams had become more affordable. Government family allowances, wartime support services, and post-war social programs all made it more likely that even working-class mothers could access basic pram models. But inequality persisted. Some prams were passed down, repaired, or improvised. A box on wheels, a wicker basket lashed to a wooden frame, wheels taken from carts or old bicycles. These prams lacked elegance, but they worked, and they told a different story, one of resourcefulness, not consumerism, of necessity, not image. In mining towns, fishing villages, and tenement-lined cities, prams were tools of survival. They carried not just bobbies, but groceries, washing, and even firewood. They weren't statements, they were solutions. War and the changing city. World War II shifted everything again. During air raids, mothers carried children to shelters, not parks. Some folded prams were adapted for emergency transport. Others were repurposed as cradles in bunkers. Post-war, the pram played a symbolic role in Britain's reconstruction. Newspapers featured returning soldiers pushing children in prams, a visual metaphor for peace, family, and national healing. Urban planners, inspired by modernist ideals, redesigned cities with families in mind: wider pavements, pedestrian zones, and baby-friendly housing estates. This urban shift gave the pram new life. But it also changed how parents moved by car, by bus, by bike. The pram had to adapt again. Enter the pushchair. By the 1950s and 60s, a new rival had emerged, the pushchair. Smaller, lighter, and collapsible, the pushchair allowed for greater flexibility. It could be folded into a car boot or carried onto a bus. It faced forward rather than toward the mother, encouraging children to observe the world. This shift unsettled some. Parenting experts worried that forward-facing children might feel abandoned. Others embraced the change, seeing it as a sign of growing independence and modernity. The debate wasn't just about comfort, it was about philosophy. What was a pram for? To protect, to stimulate, to contain, to liberate. Conclusion: wheels in motion. By the mid-20th century, the pram had become nearly universal in Britain but no longer singular. It was part of a spectrum of child mobility. Prams for infants, pushchairs for toddlers, car seats for commuters, slings for walkers. It was also deeply embedded in culture. Prams appeared in cartoons, films, and fashion. Pushing a pram became shorthand for motherhood. It conjured images of parks, routines, and quiet strength. Yet for all its visibility, the pram carried hidden histories of class division, gender roles, urban planning, and the long, slow reinvention of childhood. And so we arrive at another question. With all this cultural meaning attached to a simple wheeled carriage, how did it shape the experience of motherhood itself? By the latter half of the 20th century, the pram had become as much a symbol of motherhood as the cradle or the feeding bottle. But it was not just a practical object, it was a mirror, reflecting the expectations, pressures, and identities of women raising children in an increasingly modern world. In this final section, we follow the trajectory of the pram into the modern era, tracing how it shaped, and was shaped by evolving ideas of parenting, gender, and mobility. We examine how a rolling bed for bobbies became both a facilitator of freedom and a subtle tool of surveillance. The pram as extension of the mother. To push a pram was to be seen. For decades, women moving through public space with a pram were visible in a way few others were. They occupied sidewalks, waited at crossings, entered shops, sat in parks. Often, they were alone but not really alone. They were accompanied by the child and by the performance of care. The pram became a kind of uniform signaling maternity without a word. It told strangers, this is a woman with responsibilities, with tenderness, with labor both domestic and emotional. But it also told other women something quieter. You are not alone in this. Pram etiquette and social boundaries. In mid-century Britain, unspoken rules governed how a pram should be used, pushed, and parked. In shops, mothers were expected to keep prams close but unobtrusive. Blocking an aisle was bad form. On buses, conductors sometimes refused boarding to pram pushers, unless the vehicle was near empty. In parks, mothers formed informal clusters sharing benches, bottles, and gossip, creating temporary maternal communities. These conventions created subtle hierarchies. Prams were judged for cleanliness, modernity, and style. A well-kept pram said, "This child is loved. This mother is competent." A soiled or broken one could spark quiet judgment. Even the pace at which a pram was pushed conveyed meaning. Too fast suggested stress. Too slow, perhaps inattention. There was no manual, but there were expectations. The pram and class distinctions. Despite growing affordability, prams remained class-coded well into the 20th century. The iconic silver cross Balmoral, used by the royal family, retained its status as the Rolls-Royce of prams. Its massive wheels, gleaming body, and high suspension turned heads wherever it went. For middle-class families, prams like the coach-built Mothercare became a status marker. Matching covers, rain shields, and sheepskin liners were part of the aesthetic. Meanwhile, working-class mothers often used simpler models, foldable, functional, and passed down between siblings. These prams were practical but plain, their wear and tear visible. Some poorer families made do without. Children were carried, walked, or bundled into shopping trolleys. In certain areas, a pram was a luxury, another thing the neighbors would notice you didn't have. Fathers in the pram. The image of the pram-pushing father was rare until well into the 1970s. Traditionally, the pram and caregiving in general was viewed as women's work. Men might carry older children on their shoulders or kick a football in the park, but few would be seen navigating a baby carriage down the high street. Those who did often attracted stares or admiration. Photographs from the post-war years occasionally depict young fathers in rolled-up sleeves, awkwardly steering a pram while their wives walked beside them. These images hint at changing gender roles, but also at how radical, even rebellious, it was for a man to be visibly nurturing in public. In time, baby gear would be redesigned with this demographic in mind, but that would take decades. In the mid-century, the pram still belonged to the mother. Prams in post-war housing. After World War II, Britain underwent massive reconstruction. Council estates, new towns, and suburban developments reshaped the landscape. But how did these changes affect parents and their prams? Designers took note. New housing estates included wider pavements, communal green spaces, and ramps, all meant to accommodate young families. Some even featured pram storage rooms or pram sheds outside tenement blocks. Still, reality often fell short. Narrow staircases, lack of lifts, and poor maintenance made pram storage a daily frustration. Mothers lugged heavy frames up flights of stairs. In some cases, they chained prams to railings outside, wrapping them in tarpaulin against the rain. In these spaces, the pram was a burden as much as a benefit. It didn't just carry children, it highlighted the shortcomings of family infrastructure. The collapse of the pram monolith. By the 1980s and 1990s, the dominance of the traditional pram was waning. Enter the buggy. Lightweight, collapsible, and forward-facing, the buggy, also known as a stroller, became the vehicle of choice for mobile, modern parenting. It could be folded with one hand, stashed in a car, or carried on a bus. It required less strength, less space, and less tradition. These new designs reflected a changing family landscape. More women working outside the home. Greater reliance on public transport. Smaller homes in urban apartments. An emphasis on convenience over display. The buggy's arrival didn't just mark a shift in engineering, it marked a shift in values. Parenting on display. As prams became more diverse, slings, joggers, travel systems, double-deckers, so too did the visibility of parenting. Mothers, and increasingly fathers, now navigated a world full of eyes. Strangers commenting on blanket choices. Shopkeepers eyeing the child's behavior. Other parents comparing models, brands, and accessories. Parenting became increasingly performative. And with the rise of digital media in the 2000s, the pram, once a private tool, entered the curated world of social platforms. Instagram feeds featured designer prams beside perfect lattes. Parenting blogs reviewed strollers the way critics once reviewed sports cars. The modern pram became content. Beyond Britain, global shifts. While this story is grounded in Britain, pram culture evolved differently around the world. In Scandinavia, robust all-weather strollers became a norm. Children slept outside in prams during naps, even in freezing temperatures. In Japan, ultra-compact prams were designed to navigate crowded trains and narrow alleys. In the U.S., jogging strollers boomed alongside suburban expansion and fitness culture. In the global South, prams often remained rare. Economic constraints, cultural norms, and infrastructure gaps meant bobbies were still mostly carried or kept at home. Here, the pram was not just a parenting tool, it was a cultural artifact, shaped by context. What the pram represents. Across eras and continents, the pram has symbolized many things. Care a child tended to, wheeled gently through the world. Mobility the parent, not confined but moving. Visibility parenting made public, subject to praise or scrutiny. Class who can afford it, who can't. Change the slow, rolling transformation of childhood and motherhood. It is a domestic object that lives in public space, and as such, it has always been more than it appears. Full circle, the pram today. In the 21st century, the pram has come full circle, now available in every imaginable form. Vintage-style coach-built prams for nostalgia. Smart strollers with GPS and self-braking features. Ultralight travel models for international flights. Daddy strollers in matte black, marketed to modern men. All-terrain joggers for fitness-focused families. No longer confined to one model or message, the pram now adapts to the parent, rather than the other way around. But the questions it raises remain the same. How do we parent in public? What does mobility mean for caregivers? And what do our baby carriages say about us? A quiet revolution on wheels. The pram did not end child labor. It did not build schools. It did not feed the hungry or house the homeless. But it made something else possible: presence. It allowed mothers and later fathers to enter public life while caring. It redefined domesticity not as seclusion, but as movement. It forced cities to accommodate the needs of the smallest citizens and the people who loved them. And over time, it helped to shift the center of parenting from the shadows of private homes to the pathways of public space. Final reflection. So the next time you see a parent pushing a child on a rainy pavement, in a crowded shop, up a steep hill, remember, they are not just moving a baby. They are carrying history. A history of motherhood, class, architecture, technology, and care. And always quietly moving forward. Story 4. Toys of tin and wood play in an industrial age. In a world where children once labored long hours in factories or swept soot from flues, the idea of a child having free time was once unimaginable. But by the mid-19th century, something quietly revolutionary began to take root: play. This wasn't the organized sports or elaborate birthday parties we know today. It was something smaller, simpler, yet no less profound. Children were beginning to have hours of the day not dictated by labor, school, or chores. And into this new pocket of time entered a flood of objects made just for them. This section explores the emergence of toys in industrial-era Britain, tracing how mass production, middle-class values, and new ideas about childhood turned play into a business and a battleground for moral and social development. When play was work. Before the Industrial Revolution, most children's toys were homemade if they had any at all. Rural children fashioned dolls from rags, carved animals from wood, or played with stones, hoops, and bits of cloth. These toys were not always distinct from tools. A boy might play with a stick by pretending to plow like his father. A girl might wrap a piece of cloth as if it were an infant, mimicking her mother's work in child rearing. Play was often preparation, imitating adult roles, learning social cues. It was both entertainment and education. But only the wealthiest families had store-bought toys, miniature tea sets, rocking horses, or mechanical contraptions imported from Europe. For the poor, toys were a luxury, not a right. The toy industry awakens. That began to change in the early 1800s. Industrialization meant that goods could be made faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers than ever before. Factories that once produced machine parts or tin utensils began to apply their methods to toys. In the 1830s and 40s, London's East End, Birmingham, and Nuremberg, Germany became hubs of toy production. Artisans were replaced by workers on assembly lines, churning out inexpensive playthings in tin, wood, papier-mâché, and later celluloid. Suddenly, even families of modest means could afford a small toy at Christmas or a birthday. The toy had moved from the manor to the marketplace. A moral dilemma in miniature. The rise of toys brought excitement, but also anxiety. Victorian society placed great emphasis on self-discipline, moral instruction, and productive behavior. Idle hands, it was said, did the devil's work. So what role did play serve? Was it indulgent, dangerous, or perhaps a way to shape the future citizen? Toymakers and retailers stepped into this debate by crafting items that were not just fun but instructive. Toy soldiers taught patriotism. Miniature sewing kits trained girls for domesticity. Building blocks promoted order and structure. Alphabet cubes and counting frames disguised learning as leisure. Play in Victorian England had to justify itself. Girls and dolls, boys and guns. Toys quickly became gendered. Girls were given. Dolls with bonnets and cribs. Miniature kitchens with pans and ovens. Paper dolls with fashionable outfits. Sewing cards and embroidery hoops. These toys emphasized care, beauty, and preparation for motherhood. A well-kept doll became a proxy child. Girls were praised for tending, feeding, and clothing their toys as though rehearsing their future domestic roles. Boys received toy soldiers in tin or lead, wooden muskets and pistols, model trains and steam engines, forts, drums, and sailboats. These reinforced courage, exploration, and eventual leadership. War was romanticized. Empire was glorified. The toy chest was a miniature battleground of national identity. In both cases, the toys were less about freedom and more about formation. Christmas and the commercialization of play. The mid-19th century also saw the rise of Christmas as a child-focused holiday. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's German-style celebrations, complete with decorated trees and gifts, set a powerful example. By the 1860s, toy shops flourished in cities. Windows glowed with trains, dolls, hoops, and Noah's Arks. Illustrated catalogs from companies like Gamages and Hamleys offered toys by mail order. Children were encouraged to dream, to wish, to behave for Santa. Toys were now seasonal, symbolic, and mass-marketed. For middle-class families, Christmas became a moment to display prosperity and affection through gift-giving. For working-class families, it was often the only time of year a child might receive a new toy. The link between love and material play had been forged. The toymakers. Several prominent toy manufacturers emerged during this era. Britain's Limited, founded 1893, became famous for its lead toy soldiers, detailed and durable. Lions Bros, later known as Triang, produced everything from dollhouses to tricycles. Chad Valley G&J lines, and Wilkinson's turned out plush animals, tin toys, and wooden wagons. Though many factories were based in Britain, German imports dominated parts of the market, especially for mechanical and wind-up toys. Their quality and innovation set a standard British manufacturers struggled to match until the early 20th century. Behind the scenes, factory laborers, often women and children, assembled these playthings by hand, working long hours for little pay. The irony was not lost on reformers. The children who made the toys often could not afford to play with them. The rag and bone trade. For the poorest children, even a cheap toy might be out of reach, but not all hope was lost. Victorian cities were teeming with rag and bone men dealers who bought and resold used goods. Toys were sometimes found among the scrap: a broken soldier, a faded doll, a cracked hoop. Children in slums became scavengers and inventors. They made kites from newspaper, skates from scrap wood, or dolls from corn cobs. A discarded tin could become a drum. A chalk drawing on a pavement became a game board. In this way, play persisted even in poverty. It was less about the object than the imagination. Outdoor play and the rise of the street. While wealthier children played indoors or in gardens, working-class children often claimed the streets as their playground. Games like hoop rolling with iron or wooden hoops, skipping ropes often made from discarded rope, marbles, conkers, and knucklebones, blind man's bluff, tag, and hopscotch, and later kick the can and early football. These were social, noisy, and physical. They required space and sometimes clashed with adult expectations of order and quiet. Street play was tolerated, but never fully accepted. As cities grew denser, reformers began to push for designated play areas, the forerunners of today's playgrounds. The toy and the public park were on a slow collision course. Educational play, the Froebel legacy. In parallel, educators began to recognize the role of play in cognitive development. Friedrich Froebel, a German educator, had introduced the concept of the kindergarten, a children's garden of guided play and sensory learning. His ideas reached Britain by the 1850s and influenced early childhood education for decades. Froebel's gifts, simple geometric toys like balls, cubes, and rods, were designed to teach spatial reasoning and harmony. His occupation exercises, folding, modeling, weaving, encouraged fine motor skills and concentration. These ideas found their way into schoolrooms and toy stores alike, shaping the market for constructive toys, building blocks, puzzles, pegboards. Play, once seen as indulgent, had become respectable, even necessary. The emergence of toy libraries and lending. In poor districts, access to toys remained uneven. Some charities began establishing toy libraries, places where children could borrow toys for a set period. Others distributed simple playthings during holidays or church events. These services reflected a growing belief that every child deserved the chance to play, regardless of income. They also reinforced class divides, those who borrowed and those who bought. Yet in both cases, the toy had become normalized, a recognized part of childhood. The emotional bond. For many children, toys became more than objects. They were companions, symbols, and security. A favorite doll, scratched and worn, held the imprint of years of care. A tin soldier, dented from battles, became a hero. A stuffed bear became a confidant. These toys were personal, sometimes fiercely so. Adults began to recognize this bond. Children's literature featured beloved toys like the Velveteen Rabbit or Peter Rabbit that blurred the line between object and friend. Even psychologists began to study how toys helped children express emotion, develop empathy, and process experience. The toy chest had become a theater of identity. The paradox of the Victorian toy. And yet, for all their charm, toys were not neutral. They reinforced class, gender, nationalism, and morality. They taught children what roles were expected, what dreams were permitted, and what futures were imaginable. They were gifts, but also lessons. Even the joy they brought was shaped by adult desires, for order, for obedience, for preparation. Victorian toys made room for imagination, but often within very narrow lines. So we ask, with play becoming a market, a classroom, and a cultural message, what happens when children begin to question the roles their toys have taught them? As the Victorian age progressed into the early 20th century, toys no longer hovered at the margins of daily life, they moved to its center. With the rise of mass production, rising literacy rates, the spread of department stores, and increasing public interest in child psychology, the toy became a battleground. This wasn't a battle of armies or revolutions, it was quieter, but deeply influential. It was a struggle over what kind of adult a child should become, and who had the right to decide that through the objects a child played with. In this section, we examine how toys became instruments of ideology, spreading ideas of gender, class, empire, and behavior. We also look at how children, often underestimated, pushed back bending, breaking, or transforming their toys in unexpected ways. Toys as social blueprints. A toy is never just a toy. Even the simplest ones contain layers of assumptions about who the child is, what they need, and who they will become. For the Victorians obsessed with order, hierarchy, and moral instruction, this was especially true. Toys became silent tutors. They taught a child how to behave, what to value, and what their future role might be. A doll's house didn't just entertain, it modeled domestic order, tidiness, and gender roles. A Noah's Ark set, filled with hand-painted animals, reinforced biblical lessons and the importance of obedience. A building set, such as wooden bricks or meccano, introduced in 1901, was promoted for boys to develop logic, mechanics, and creativity. Even something as basic as a jump rope was praised for keeping girls active but modest, with rules about how high they could skip or what songs they sang while doing so. These toys were tools of cultural formation. The gendered toy aisle before there were aisles. Long before modern marketing separated pink from blue, the Victorian toy world was rigidly divided, not by color, but by function. Girls were trained in nurturing with dolls and cradles, domestic arts with toy brooms, ironing boards, kitchen sets, beauty and fashion, paper dolls, mirrors, lace-making kits. Boys were encouraged toward exploration, toy compasses, globes, miniature maps, combat soldiers, forts, toy cannons, industry, model railways, printing presses, tool kits. The expectations were clear. Girls were homemakers in training. Boys were workers, soldiers, and leaders in waiting. Toy catalogs, instruction manuals, and magazine stories reinforced these roles. Few items crossed the divide. If a boy played with a doll or a girl commandeered a toy cannon, it was treated with humor or concern. Play was not neutral. It was coded, policed, and shaped. Toys of empire. One of the most overlooked aspects of Victorian toys is how they were steeped in imperial ideology. Britain, during this era, was at the height of its empire. Its colonies stretched from Canada to India, Australia to Africa, and this global reach filtered into the nursery. Toy soldiers marched in red coats and pith helmets. Board games like the game of British Empire had players race to claim colonies. Puzzles featured maps with British possessions colored in pink. Picture books showed white children in safari gear, civilizing natives, taming wild animals, and raising the Union Jack. These toys didn't just reflect empire, they normalized it. For children who would never leave the Midlands or Manchester, empire was made familiar through the toy chest. It seemed natural, inevitable, and even fun. The good toy versus the bad toy. Victorian moralists often drew a line between educational toys and frivolous ones. A good toy was constructive, quiet, morally instructive, neatly stored away. A bad toy was noisy, violent if not underpinned by patriotism, messy, bought from street vendors or hawkers. Authorities feared that uncontrolled play, especially in the street, led to vice, idleness, or criminality. Rag balls, spinning tops, and marbles could lead to gambling. Too much laughter could mean too little discipline. As a result, schools and churches offered approved toys during holidays or charity events. These were often religious, wholesome, and deeply dull. But children, of course, had their own opinions. Children's resistance, breaking the toy. Children are not passive recipients of adult values. They bend, reshape, repurpose, and reject. Even in the buttoned-up world of Victorian Britain, kids found ways to subvert the intentions of the toys given to them. A doll might become a pirate. A toy soldier might become a villain. Wooden bricks, meant for buildings, might be turned into weapons or towers for imaginary animals. Some boys used their sisters' dollhouses to stage battles. Some girls turned sewing sets into tools for escape, stitching little flags or tiny satchels for make-believe journeys. There are even recorded cases of children drawing mustaches on dolls, smashing boring educational toys, or burying unwanted playthings in the garden. This subtle rebellion suggests a deeper truth. Children play with their toys, but also through them exploring power, resistance, and selfhood. The urban toyscape. In working-class neighborhoods, especially in London's East End, Leeds, and Glasgow, children's play was shaped more by place than by objects. The street was their stage, cobbled alleys became racetracks, gas lamps were goalposts, empty barrels became hiding places. Chalk became a currency used to draw hopscotch grids, mazes, or secret messages. Buttons were traded like coins or used as tokens in games. Bottle caps became makeshift soldiers. Here, the absence of commercial toys did not mean the absence of play. In fact, many children developed elaborate games, rules, and traditions with no physical toys at all, just imagination, and whatever the urban environment could offer. Play was communal, improvised, and often short-lived, interrupted by police, parents, or street vendors. The rise of board games. Another significant development during this period was the Victorian board game. Influenced by religious and educational reformers, many early games were designed to teach moral lessons. The Mansion of Happiness, 1843, led players toward virtuous living. The New Game of Human Life guided players through temptation and consequence. Journey Through the Bible reinforced scriptural knowledge. Later games added themes of empire, science, and industry. Railways, telegraphs, and colonial exploits were popular subjects. These games helped structure family time in the evenings, particularly among the middle class. They also introduced the idea of competitive leisure, a concept that would dominate the 20th century toy market. The commodification of imagination. With the toy market booming by the end of the 19th century, play became increasingly commercialized. Catalogs from companies like Hamleys, Gamages, and Whiteley's offered entire pages of toys organized by age, gender, and function. The perfect gift for a growing boy. Every young lady's delight. For the curious child. Advertisements began to shape desire, telling children what they should want, and parents what they should provide. The gift of a toy was no longer a rare treat, it was part of an annual rhythm, tied to holidays, birthdays, or school milestones. Toys were no longer just items, they were experiences. And increasingly, they came with stories, identities, and brand loyalty. Dolls with stories. Perhaps the most emotionally complex toys of the Victorian period were dolls. Initially carved from wood, they later appeared in wax, china, and cloth. Some had movable limbs, changeable clothes, even eyes that opened and closed. Dolls were given names, backstories, personalities. For girls especially, dolls became a rehearsal space for caregiving, but also a way to process emotion, imagine relationships, and explore social roles. In middle-class households, elaborate dollhouses mimicked real Victorian homes with drawing rooms, nurseries, and servants' quarters. These weren't just toys. They were social scripts in miniature. Yet dolls also carried deeper tensions. They embodied expectations. A proper girl cared for her doll just as she was expected to care for her future family. If the doll was lost, broken, or rejected, what did it say about the child? Toys and the birth of nostalgia. By the turn of the 20th century, adults were beginning to look back on their childhood toys with affection. Memoirs, illustrations, and even museum collections celebrated toys as emblems of innocence, simplicity, and national character. This nostalgia helped solidify the idea of childhood as a golden age, a time distinct from adulthood, deserving of protection and reverence. Toys were no longer just objects of the present. They became anchors to the past for individuals and for culture at large. And yet, with all this celebration of childhood, a deeper question remained. What does it mean when an industry begins to define how children imagine themselves? As the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian age, and eventually, the upheavals of the 20th century, toys moved from being objects of novelty or moral instruction to something more enduring, artifacts of identity, culture, and memory. In this final section, we examine the long shadow of Victorian toys, how they shaped childhood well beyond their own era, how they helped construct national myths, and how they reveal the quiet but powerful ways play has always been political. We'll also explore how toys survived not just in bedrooms and parlors, but in the minds of those who grew up with them long after the tin had rusted and the wood had splintered. The child becomes a consumer. By the early 20th century, the toy market had matured into a business. Factories produced not dozens, but hundreds of thousands of toys each year. Toy fairs were held, patents were filed, catalogs were mailed across Britain and the Empire. Children were no longer just recipients of toys, they were targets. Their desires were anticipated, shaped, and guided. Ads in magazines featured gleaming train sets with captions like, "Every boy's dream." Department stores set up Christmas grottos filled with plush animals and dolls. Teachers and doctors began recommending certain toys for development and appropriate stimulation. And parents were told, more urgently each year, that the right toys could make the difference between a good child and a bad one, a successful adult and a failed one. Play had become a form of investment. The mechanical marvel. One of the greatest innovations in the late Victorian and Edwardian toy world was the mechanical or wind-up toy. Clockwork motors borrowed from watchmaking and music box design powered tin animals, hopping birds, marching soldiers, and more. German manufacturers in Nuremberg led the field, producing toys that moved, clicked, and clanged with uncanny realism. Children were enthralled. These toys did things. They moved on their own, responded to touch, and introduced the idea of cause and effect into play. But they also added a new dimension: failure. Mechanical toys could break, springs snapped, gears jammed, keys were lost, and repairs, especially for working-class families, weren't always possible. This fragility became part of the experience. A toy could now die, and with it, a small lesson about impermanence. The empire in miniature. As Britain's empire reached its peak, its imagery increasingly saturated the toy industry. Miniature tea sets came decorated with Union Jacks and royal portraits. Lead soldiers were sold in sets: Highlanders, Lancers, Bengal rifles. Toy zoos featured elephants, lions, and exotic animals from the colonies. Toy ships bore names like HMS Victory or Britannia. These weren't just amusements. They were rehearsals for empire, teaching children from the earliest age that the world was theirs to explore, control, and civilize. Even in games of pretend, the lines of power were clear. The British child commanded, the colonial figure obeyed. Rarely did toys depict the costs of empire. There were no famine victims, no enslaved peoples, no wounded soldiers returning from imperial wars. The toy world was clean, safe, and victorious. It wasn't a lie, it was an imagination under management. War toys and their discontents. After the Boer War, 1899–1902, and especially following World War I, attitudes toward war-themed toys began to shift. Previously celebrated, toy soldiers and weapons began to attract criticism from pacifists and educators who worried that such toys glamorized violence. Letters to newspapers expressed concern that boys were playing at bloodshed. Others defended them as patriotic, historical, or simply inevitable. Children, they said, always turned sticks into swords. Manufacturers began to soften the imagery. Soldiers appeared in ceremonial dress, not combat poses. New emphasis was placed on rescue toys, fire trucks, ambulances, lifeboats. These too carried messages, of course, about order, duty, and British stoicism. Toys had not lost their ideological weight. It had simply shifted. The doll's world expands. By the early 20th century, dolls had become more than static companions. They came with wardrobes, accessories, and personalities. Some were modeled after real Barbies, encouraging caregiving. Others were elegant ladies with changeable outfits, inviting fashion and fantasy. A few, controversially, depicted colonial figures in exotic dress, reinforcing racial hierarchies through play. Manufacturers even experimented with talking dolls, though early attempts were clumsy and expensive. Some dolls had glass eyes that opened and closed. Others cried when tipped or drank from bottles. But the emotional connection children formed with dolls remained consistent. In letters, diaries, and interviews, adults often remembered dolls not just as toys but as friends. Losing one could feel like a death. In a world where emotional expression was often discouraged, especially among boys, dolls provided a rare outlet for tenderness. Museums of memory. By the mid-20th century, antique toys began to enter museums. The Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood, later part of the V&A, began collecting in the 1920s, preserving tin locomotives, wooden puppets, and rag dolls for public viewing. These displays treated toys as artifacts of cultural history, not just tools of childhood, but mirrors of society. Visitors saw their own childhoods reflected behind glass. Toys became nostalgic objects, symbols of a simpler time, even when the reality had been anything but simple. In preserving toys, society was also preserving its myths. That children were always innocent. That play was always joyful. That Victorian Britain had raised generations with care and order. Yet the scratches, dents, and missing parts in these toys whispered a truer story. Psychological turns. In the early 20th century, thinkers like Jean Piaget and Sigmund Freud began examining childhood development. They saw play not as idle amusement, but as essential to growth, identity, and emotional processing. Toys became diagnostic tools. Psychologists studied how children interacted with them. Did they nurture, destroy, ignore? Did they repeat patterns? Did they role-play anxieties or conflicts? This marked a shift. Toys were not only shaping children, they were revealing them. Parents, too, were now urged to observe how their child played. Was it normal? Was it creative? Was it healthy? A new layer of judgment had entered the nursery, not just about what the toy was, but what it meant. The market grows up. As the century progressed, toys became more age-specific. What had once been handed down, regardless of age, was now tailored for precise developmental stages. Infants, rattles, teething rings, plush animals. Toddlers, blocks, shape sorters, push-along carts. School-aged, puzzles, kits, board games, construction toys. Older children, chemistry sets, model trains, art supplies. Toy stores were organized accordingly. Parenting books offered timelines. Milestones became industry buzzwords. A child's age and presumed ability now dictated not just school level, but what they were allowed to play with. Childhood was increasingly managed by product categories. Resistance and rebellion again. But as always, children found ways around the rules. Girls used dolls as warriors. Boys dressed teddy bears in their sisters' clothes. Toys meant for construction were used for destruction. Board games had their rules bent or replaced entirely. Children collaborated, competed, negotiated. They invented imaginary worlds with no adult oversight. They gave voices to silent toys. They staged dramas in which animals spoke, trains flew, and soldiers danced. The toy, no matter how carefully designed, could never fully dictate play. It could offer suggestions, but children always made their own meaning. What toys remember? If you hold an old toy, its edges worn, its paint faded, you're not just holding a relic. You're holding a memory of someone's hand, someone's laughter, someone's escape. Toys remember the floors they slid across, the names they were given, the hiding spots they were stashed in, the rainstorms that soaked them, the arguments they interrupted, the goodbyes they outlasted. They carry the smell of a coal fire, the quiet of a shared bedroom, the touch of fingers long grown. More than books or photographs, toys preserve feelings often wordless, often powerful. Reflections on the toy A. So what did Victorian toys leave behind? They helped establish the idea of childhood as a developmental stage, not just a smaller version of adulthood. They contributed to mass culture, teaching values, roles, and ideologies in forms more persuasive than sermons. They shaped gender norms, class identity, and national mythologies quietly, daily, intimately. They were instruments of control, but also tools of resistance. Above all, they gave children something that had long been denied: time and space to imagine. The final thought. In the end, a toy is a small thing, easy to overlook, easy to lose. But in the hands of a child, especially, a child just beginning to taste freedom, it becomes something more. A stage, a story, a way of asking, who am I, who might I become? And sometimes, that small question asked in the silence between clattering wheels or whispered into the ear of a stuffed bear is the first spark of a life lived beyond survival. Story 5. Penny Dreadfuls and Moral Tales: What Children Read. In the flickering glow of gas lamps and firelight, as the long Victorian evenings settled over crowded tenements and modest parlors, a quiet revolution was taking place, one bound not in chains but in paper and ink. Children, especially those from working-class families, were beginning to read. Not just the Psalms or catechisms or school primers, but stories gripping, outrageous, sentimental, sometimes scandalous. Stories that thrilled and frightened. Stories that preached and punished. This was the age of the penny dreadful and the moral tale, two literary currents that flowed through the same streets, offering competing visions of who children were and who they ought to become. In this section, we explore how reading became a central battleground in Victorian efforts to shape childhood, charting the rise of cheap fiction, the fears it provoked, and the more respectable alternatives that tried to hold the line. Literacy on the rise. In 1837, at the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign, fewer than half of all children in England could read. By 1901, that number had soared to over 90%. What changed? The answer lies in education reform. The 1870 Elementary Education Act, Forster's Act, made schooling compulsory for children aged 5–13. Though patchy in early implementation, it created a generation that could and increasingly wanted to read. At first, reading meant recitation. Classrooms drilled children on syllables and Bible verses. But once children mastered the mechanics, a hunger emerged for something more entertaining. They found it at the newsstand. The penny dreadful appears. In the 1830s and 40s, a new form of cheap literature emerged. Serialized tales printed on flimsy paper, sold for a penny apiece. Hence the name, Penny Dreadfuls. They were often published weekly, with titles like Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, Varney the Vampire, Black Bess or the Knight of the Road, Spring-Heeled Jack. These stories were lurid, violent, and sensational. Heroes were highwaymen, pirates, and supernatural fiends. Blood was spilled, secrets revealed, villains sometimes triumphed. Redemption was rare. Illustrations crude but vivid captured the imaginations of young readers. Cliffhangers kept them coming back, and for many boys especially, penny dreadfuls offered a first taste of reading for pleasure. The moral panic begins. Not everyone was pleased. Teachers, clergymen, and parents quickly raised alarm. These publications, they argued, corrupted youth, encouraged delinquency, and eroded moral values. Critics said penny dreadfuls taught boys to admire criminals, to mock authority, and to waste time better spent in study or prayer. Newspapers ran articles warning of literary poison. Libraries refused to stock them. School inspectors warned that reading such stories led to truancy and theft. In 1895, the Times decried penny fiction as a school for murder. Were the fears justified? Historians disagree. While some juvenile crime was linked at least by authorities to penny dreadful readership, many children simply read them with wide eyes and returned to their daily lives unchanged. The greater concern may have been this. The dreadfuls gave working-class children a voice of their own, and one that didn't sound like their elders. The dreadfuls go underground, and then everywhere. Despite moral outrage, penny dreadfuls flourished. Publishers like Edward Lloyd and George Emmett grew rich from their circulation. Street vendors hawked the latest installment each Saturday. Boys traded and shared issues, forming informal networks of literacy. Some dreadfuls sold over 250,000 copies per week. Eventually, the genre diversified. Some stories featured detectives and boy heroes. Others dabbled in sci-fi, mystery, and historical adventure. By the 1880s, dreadfuls were rebranded into Boys Weekly, still thrilling, but toned down. Some even took on a patriotic tone, aligning adventure with service to the Empire. The Boys of the Empire, the Union Jack and Chums, offered stories of schoolboy loyalty, military honor, and moral clarity. The boundaries between dreadful and didactic blurred. Still, the reputation lingered. For the Victorian elite, penny dreadful remained shorthand for lowbrow, dangerous, and working class. Girls, reading, and respectability. What about girls? While many girls did read penny dreadfuls, sometimes in secret, their reading was more tightly policed. Parents and teachers steered them toward moral tale-y stories that emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the quiet virtues of domestic life. Publishers like The Religious tracked society, and authors like Charlotte Yonge and Hespa Stretton produced countless volumes aimed at shaping the proper girl. Titles included Jessica's First Prayer, The Basket of Flowers, The Wide, Wide World, Stepping Heavenward. These stories often followed a strict formula. A virtuous but poor heroine faces hardship. She resists temptation or repents after failing. She finds redemption through faith, obedience, and self-sacrifice. She is rewarded often not with marriage or wealth, but with spiritual peace. Death was common. Many girl heroines died young sweetly, nobly, inspiring others. The moral was clear. Suffering with grace was the highest female calling. Sunday reading and the tract culture. For children in devout households, Sundays were reserved for religious reading. This included Bible stories, Daniel in the Lion's Den, Joseph and his coat. Parables rewritten for children. Missionary tales, British children converting or aiding heathen children in far-off lands. Conversion narratives in which naughty or rebellious children saw the light and reformed. Sunday reading was meant to be edifying, but it could also be deeply emotional. Many children were genuinely moved by the stories of loss, redemption, and divine forgiveness. In an age where mortality loomed over every home, the idea of heaven held real weight. Still, some children snuck dreadfuls between the pages of their Bibles. Picture books and early readers. Not all children were drawn to text-heavy tales. For younger readers, the Victorian age offered a growing array of picture books, alphabet primers and fables. Publishers like Dean and Son and McLaughlin Brothers in the U.S. used chromolithography to create colorful, attractive volumes. These books introduced nursery rhymes, Sing a Song of Sixpence, fairy tales, often heavily sanitized versions of Grimm, alphabet rhymes and counting books, animal fables and cautionary tales. Beatrix Potter's work arrived late in the period, with beautifully illustrated stories like The Tale of Peter Rabbit, 1902, combining charm with gentle moral lessons. For the youngest children, books were not just instruction, they were objects of beauty, wonder, and imagination. School books and literacy. Meanwhile, in school, children read from readers, primers, and spelling books designed for moral instruction and standardization. A typical school reader might include fables, often Aesop's, short biographies of inventors or moral figures, poems about duty, hard work, and the seasons, passages from scripture or national history. These books emphasized reading aloud, enunciation, and memory. Children were not encouraged to question, reinterpret, or enjoy, they were to absorb and reproduce. But reading, once learned, could not be confined. Many children who learned to read in school went on to read beyond it. Lending libraries and book societies. While books remained expensive for the working class, lending libraries helped bridge the gap. Some were commercial, charging a small fee per book. Others were charitable, run by churches or reform groups. Some factories and workhouses even offered basic libraries for young workers. Children's reading choices were often monitored. Librarians might suggest improving books over adventure tales, but readers found ways to navigate the system, choosing entertainment when they could, learning to swap and share. Book clubs and story circles sprang up, especially among girls. Reading became social as well as solitary. The unseen readers. Not all children read freely. Blind children had limited options. Braille, invented in the 1820s, was not widely adopted in Britain until later. Working children often had little time or light for books. Many read by candle or street lamp after long shifts. Non-English speaking children, including Irish immigrants and Welsh speakers, found few books in their own languages. Yet literacy, once acquired, was empowering. It allowed children to read signs, navigate streets, sign forms, and write letters. In some cases, it opened doors to jobs, activism, or artistic expression. Reading as escape. For many children, books, especially the penny dreadfuls, offered a way out. Out of slums, classrooms, factories, and expectations. Out of the cold and the noise, into a world where anything might happen. A world where the villain could be clever, the poor boy could triumph, the girl could speak back. The ending, for once, might not be ordained. Adults worried about this power. They were right to. Books change people. And so we ask, as more children began reading hungrily, secretly, joyfully, who really held the pen? The author, the parent, or the child who turned each page, imagining themselves into the story? As literacy spread across Victorian Britain and more children learned not just how to read, but what they liked to read, a quiet but determined struggle emerged. This wasn't a war over words, it was a war over influence. Who would shape the child's imagination? Would it be the publisher of the penny dreadful, filling minds with pirates and monsters, anti-heroes and gunpowder? Or the moralist author, determined to lead young souls along the straight and narrow, warning of sin and vice? In this section, we delve deeper into the cultural tensions around children's reading material, tracing the campaigns to guide, censor, inspire, or restrict what young readers consumed, and how children, as always, often slip through the cracks of adult intention. Improving literature, the rise of the moral publisher. As the popularity of penny dreadfuls surged, so did the counterattack. A wave of moral publishers sought to produce wholesome, alternatives books that were entertaining enough to hold attention, but safe enough to satisfy parents, teachers, and clergymen. Leading the charge were Books the Religious Tract Society, RTS. Founded in 1799, the RTS expanded rapidly in the 19th century, publishing thousands of titles aimed at shaping upright character through literature. Their books avoided bloodshed, supernatural horror, or romantic rebellion. Instead, they offered tales of orphan girls who found faith and family, boys who resisted temptation and were rewarded with modest success, children who died piously, inspiring those around them. Books like Jessica's First Prayer by Hesper Stretton, 1867, became massive bestsellers, praised for their emotional pull and evangelical message. The RTS also published the Boys' Own Paper and Girls' Own Paper, weekly magazines filled with serialized fiction, moral essays, Christian advice, and even science articles, always carefully filtered through a lens of respectability. The Boys' Own Paper versus the Dreadfuls. First published in 1879, The Boys' Own Paper was Britain's most sustained effort to offer boys clean, adventure fiction. It featured serialized tales of bravery and sportsmanship, missionary exploits in far-off lands, biographies of inventors, explorers, and naval heroes, moral poetry and essays on manliness, hygiene, and obedience. It walked a fine line, offering action and drama without glorifying lawlessness or immorality. Pirates might appear, but only to be defeated. Soldiers fought, but always for queen and country, not for loot or personal gain. For middle-class boys, The Boys' Own Paper was a fixture of the school locker and the Christmas stocking. For working-class readers, it was more aspirational and often more expensive than the dreadfuls they devoured at a penny apiece. Publishers knew this, which is why the moralists had to fight not just with values, but with price. Reading clubs, Sunday schools, and gatekeeping. To combat the spread of sensational fiction, reformers tried to control the places children got their books. Sunday school libraries offered moral literature and refused to carry objectionable stories. Temperance halls and settlement houses hosted reading circles. Mission societies printed leaflets warning against poisonous papers. Parents were encouraged to inspect books, monitor reading, and limit access. Victorian Britain saw the child as impressionable and therefore vulnerable. Reading was considered a powerful, potentially dangerous influence, especially in private. Girls reading romance stories were feared to be too easily stirred. Boys reading about crime might imitate it. Even too much harmless fiction was thought to cause laziness, nervousness, or fanciful thinking. In some quarters, a child reading alone was cause for concern. The dime novel invasion. Across the Atlantic, a parallel phenomenon was unfolding. American dime novels, similar to penny dreadfuls, were also making their way to British markets by the 1870s. These books, filled with Wild West adventures, gangsters, and swashbuckling heroes, thrilled young readers and deeply alarmed reformers. Characters like Buffalo Bill, Deadwood Dick, and Jesse James crossed the ocean and quickly took root in the imaginations of British boys. Cheap, brash, and written in fast-paced, accessible prose, dime novels pushed the penny dreadful into new territory. They also diluted moral messages. Violence wasn't always punished. Criminals weren't always condemned. Sometimes they even won. The idea that storytelling might be morally ambiguous was profoundly uncomfortable to Victorian moralists. Girls push boundaries. While much of the reading panic focused on boys, girls, too, were finding their own rebellious roots into fiction. Some secretly read penny dreadfuls, sharing them under school desks or between chores. Others devoured sensational serialized novels aimed at adults like those by Wilkie Collins or Mrs. Henry Wood. The heroine in these books wasn't always pious or passive. Sometimes she was cunning. Sometimes she fell. Sometimes she loved passionately and paid a price. Even respectable authors like Charlotte Bronte and Frances Hodgson Burnett, author of A Little Princess, began writing female characters who were angry, ambitious, and intelligent. Not saints, just human. The moral tale was evolving. The tidy, tragic girl saint was giving way to something messier, more real. The strange appeal of death. One curious feature of Victorian children's literature, both moral and sensational, is how often it featured death. Children died of illness, self-sacrifice, or divine will. Siblings died to teach others a lesson. Friends died and went to heaven, smiling peacefully as family gathered around. Why so much death? Partly it reflected reality. Victorian child mortality rates were high. Death was not a rare tragedy, it was part of life. Children attended funerals. They saw siblings vanish from breakfast tables. But it also served a moral purpose. In stories, death purified. The bad child repented and was forgiven on their deathbed. The good child inspired adults through their calm acceptance of fate. This wasn't nihilism. It was narrative closure, and it shaped how generations thought about virtue, suffering, and the afterlife. Reading aloud and family bonds. Not all Victorian reading was solitary or secretive. For many families, reading was a shared ritual. Fathers read newspaper articles or serialized adventure tales to their children after supper. Mothers read moral tales or scripture during the day. Older siblings helped younger ones decipher syllables. In some households, this practice created lasting intimacy. In others, it reinforced hierarchy, the adult controlling the text, the child learning to sit still and listen. But even in these settings, something remarkable could happen. A child might ask a question, challenge the ending, imagine a different fate for a character, linger on a moment the adult skimmed past. In these moments, literature stopped being lesson and became dialogue. Censorship and control. As the penny dreadful and its cousins continued to thrive, some local governments began cracking down. Newsagents were pressured to stop carrying trash literature. Schools issued reading lists and blacklists. Some cities proposed age restrictions or licensing for publishers of children's material. Most of these efforts failed. The print industry was too fast, too vast, and the demand, especially among working-class boys, was simply too strong. Publishers adapted. They softened content, renamed series, raised prices slightly to claim respectability. But the war over what children should read and who should decide never really ended. The child author and the child critic. Late in the Victorian era, a curious development emerged: children writing back. Letters to magazines like the boys' own paper and the girls' own paper sometimes included commentary on stories. Why did the girl have to die? I think the pirate was more interesting than the sailor. Could you write more about the girl who reads books instead of sewing? Some publishers even held story contests, printing submissions from readers. A few young writers went on to become authors themselves. In these letters and entries, we glimpse a startling truth. Children weren't just readers. They were interpreters, editors, creators. They didn't passively accept the story. They lived it, rewrote it, argued with it. What children actually thought. While adult opinions on literature are well documented, children's voices are harder to find. But in scattered diaries, letters, and school essays, we hear their side. A boy in 1892 wrote of his favorite dreadful. It is about a man who is wronged and he seeks revenge, but he is also clever, not cruel. I wish he won. A girl in 1888 wrote of her Sunday readings. I like the story of Ruth because she was brave and not afraid to speak. An inspector's report from 1897 noted, "Many children bring papers to school. Some teachers confiscate them. Others allow them during breaks. One boy cried when his was burned." In these fragments, we find not only preference but ownership. The story wasn't just something read, it became theirs. A closing chapter. By the early 20th century, the penny dreadful had largely disappeared, replaced by weekly comics, serialized novels, and boys and girls, papers that balanced adventure with moral tone. But the tensions never left. What should children read? Who decides? What is good literature? What is trash? And who are we really protecting, them or ourselves? Books are easy to burn, ban, or replace, but stories, they survive. And in every child who ever read under a blanket by candlelight, or whispered tales across a classroom, or imagined something different at the end of the page, there lives a small rebellion. A reminder that reading, like childhood itself, is rarely as quiet as it seems. Story 6. The invention of adolescence when childhood got longer. For most of human history, the line between childhood and adulthood was a short and brutal one. One day a child was small, the next they were working, married, or dead. There was no clear category in between, no awkward, self-reflective in-between phase marked by growth spurts, uncertainty, and emotional turbulence. There was no teenager. There was no youth culture. There was no adolescence. Until quietly and gradually there was. This section tells the story of how Victorians, caught between an older agrarian world and an emerging industrial modern society, began to discover and even invent a new phase of life, a strange, liminal stage that would come to be called adolescence. Before adolescence, a binary world. In pre-industrial societies, childhood was short. By the age of 7 or 8, most children were expected to begin contributing to family economies. By 12 or 13, many were in full-time labor, apprenticeships, or early marriages. Rituals marked the passage into adulthood: confirmation, bar mitzvah, betrothal, first employment. There was no adolescence because there was no room for it. Life was hard. Time was precious. Bodies matured earlier due to malnutrition and stress, and the demands of survival left little space for emotional self-exploration. The body aged, so did the role. But in 19th century Britain, industrialization disrupted everything. The industrial disruption. Factories and cities reorganized the structure of time, labor, and family. Children still worked, but increasingly, laws limited how much and how young. Education reforms, like the 1870 Forster Act, required more children to stay in school longer. The economy required not just laborers, but trained workers, creating a new delay between childhood and employment. And for the middle and upper classes, industrialization brought something else: leisure, a longer period before marriage, more time to think, write, and be young. Society began to notice a group of people who were not quite children, not yet adults. They were confused, restless, emotional, and increasingly visible. Science meets youth. In 1904, just after the Victorian era ended, American psychologist G. Stanley Hall published a massive 2-volume work titled Adolescence: Its Psychology and Its Relations to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. In it, Hall defined adolescence as a distinct, universal stage of life, filled with storm and stress, idealism and rebellion, emotional intensity, sexual awakening. Hall's work influenced educators, doctors, and reformers worldwide. He argued that adolescence wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a natural process that society should support and structure. Though Hall wrote in the 20th century, his ideas built on Victorian obsessions with growth, development, and control. Victorian medicine and the dangerous age. Even before Hall, Victorian doctors had begun studying youth as a distinct medical category. Adolescents, especially boys, were seen as vulnerable to moral disease, masturbation, criminality, fantasy, and disobedience. Medical journals warned of adolescent insanity, often linked to overexcitement, overwork at school, or too much reading of sensational literature. For girls, adolescence was a time of delicacy. The onset of menstruation was treated as a medical crisis. Doctors recommended rest cures, reduced mental exertion, and closely monitored emotions. In both cases, adolescence was something to be managed. Schools reinforced the category. As education expanded, so did the length of time children spent in school. Secondary education, which had once been a luxury for the elite, became more common. The Elementary Education Act of 1880 made school attendance compulsory until age 10. By the early 20th century, that age had risen to 12, and many students stayed longer. This created a population of not quite adults who were literate, curious, and delayed. They weren't yet earning. They weren't yet married. They weren't children, but they weren't fully independent either. The school became a holding space socially, emotionally, and legally for adolescents. Clothing, toys, and the in-between. Victorian children were dressed as mini adults, but by the late 19th century, a shift began. Young boys wore sailor suits, school blazers, and eventually short trousers, marking them as older than toddlers but younger than men. Teenage girls wore dresses with more modest neckline and slightly raised hems, not yet allowed the silks and corsets of womanhood. Toy manufacturers began targeting this in-between group. Boys received construction sets, mechanical puzzles, and adventure novels. Girls were given sewing kits, etiquette books, and illustrated diaries. The market had discovered the pre-adult consumer. Boys will be boys, but girls must not. Adolescence was not gendered equally. Boys were allowed, even expected, to rebel, explore, and make mistakes. Their wild oats were seen as natural, even necessary. They joined clubs, climbed trees, and read about pirates. Girls, in contrast, were warned to restrain themselves. Their bodies, moods, and thoughts were monitored. A girl's misstep could ruin her. Her future was still tied to modesty, obedience, and marriageability. Books, schools, and sermons reinforced these norms. A girl's adolescence was often a time of increased control, just as a boy became a time of increased liberty. Youth culture begins to emerge. By the late 19th century, distinct youth communities were forming. Scouting began with Robert Baden-Powell's Scouting for Boys in 1908, emphasizing discipline, outdoor skills, and patriotism. Boys, brigades, and church youth groups offered structured leisure. Debating clubs, student publications, and young men's Christian associations created social networks for older teens. These were not yet the rebellious youth cultures of the 1950s, but they were a beginning, a place where young people could forge identity separate from childhood and adulthood. Adolescents were no longer just waiting, they were being. Anxiety and the adolescent threat. With this new category came new fears. Adults worried about idleness, teens without jobs or direction, overeducation, girls becoming too smart to marry, delinquency, gangs, vandalism, and rowdy youth, romantic independence, boys and girls talking alone, moral drift, a world of novels, music halls, and public parks. Newspapers ran editorials lamenting the rise of disrespectful youth. Reformers demanded more programs, more rules, more oversight. The adolescent had arrived and was immediately suspect. The emotional core. What was adolescence really about? Behind the laws, lectures, and labels, there were young people trying to understand themselves. In their diaries and letters we find doubts about faith, confusion about attraction, anger at injustice, fear of death, hope for something different. A 14-year-old girl wrote in 1893, "I am told I must not think too much, but how do I stop?" A boy of 15 in 1886 wrote, "I have dreams I cannot tell, not even to my brother." These voices, often hidden or dismissed, remind us that adolescence is not just a social category. It's an emotional reality. The long arc begins. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, adolescence was no longer invisible. It had rules, theories, clothing, rituals, expectations, and a growing body of literature trying to explain it. It wasn't fully formed, it wasn't yet called teenagehood, but it had taken root. And it would only grow into one of the most discussed, dissected, and marketed life stages of the modern world. In the next section, we'll explore how this new in-between phase was shaped, contained, and increasingly commodified in the early 20th century, and how adolescents themselves began pushing back. As adolescence took hold as a distinct phase of life, it became more than just a social observation. It became a project. By the early 20th century, adolescence was something to be studied, monitored, guided, and above all shaped. Schools, churches, governments, publishers, and psychologists all claimed a stake in managing this new in-between generation. The adolescent was no longer simply a child becoming an adult, but a potential problem or promise to be solved. This section explores how the modern concept of adolescence solidified through institutional reform, emotional control, and the construction of a youth identity that was both embraced and policed. Institutions take charge. Once adolescence was identified as a distinct phase, social institutions raced to claim responsibility for it. Graduation capped schools. With rising school-leaving ages and expanding secondary education, schools became the default home for adolescents. Education authorities emphasized discipline. Adolescent bodies were seen as unruly. Strict timetables and uniforms helped contain them. Moral training. Religious education remained central, with a focus on self-restraint and purity. Preparation for work. Curricula divided by gender. Girls studied domestic science, boys did carpentry and bookkeeping. The goal was clear: manage the adolescent so that they emerged formed, not just educated. Place of worship. Churches. Religious groups doubled down on outreach to teenagers, forming youth fellowships, purity societies, and Bible reading circles. Boys were told to guard their thoughts. Girls were warned against vanity, romance, and emotional excess. Adolescents were cast as both vulnerable and dangerous, especially to one another. The invention of the problem teenager. By the 1910s and 1920s, adolescence had a public image. No longer a faceless transition, the adolescent was now a stock character in newspapers, novels, and official reports. And often, this character was a troublemaker. Authorities identified growing concerns: youth crime, petty theft, vandalism, and group fighting. Loitering, hanging out in groups, especially mixed gender, was suspicious. Disrespect, challenging parents, teachers, and clergy. Middle-class reformers spoke of the problem of the adolescent boy, echoing anxieties from the penny dreadful era. Even adolescent girls, previously assumed to be passive, were now a concern. The rise of flappers in the 1920s, young women with short hair, bold clothes, and open defiance of traditional norms, sparked panic in both Britain and America. The teenager had not yet been named, but the idea had teeth. The science of control. Psychology, still a young science, turned increasingly toward adolescence. Freud introduced theories of repressed desire, family conflict, and developmental tension. Behaviorists saw adolescent behavior as something to be trained. Jean Piaget, later in the century, would study cognitive development, noting how adolescents reason differently than children. Victorian and Edwardian psychiatrists fixated on masturbation madness, adolescent hysteria, moral insanity, girls who cried too much, boys who defied curfew, teens who read too many novels, all were suspect. But not all scientists framed adolescence negatively. G. Stanley Hall argued it was a creative and visionary time, a period of idealism, not just instability. Still, whether viewed with optimism or fear, adolescence was increasingly pathologized. To be young was to be in danger or to be the danger. The adolescent body, puberty, once shrouded in secrecy, became a topic of medical and parental concern. Boys were taught to manage urges, stay strong, and channel energy into sports or work. Girls were monitored for emotional instability, thought to be linked to menstruation. Doctors advised less reading, less walking, and quiet hobbies during certain days of the month. Sexuality, previously ignored or punished, now became the central topic of adolescent management. The rise of sex education, especially in post-WWI Britain, reflected a growing fear that young people were learning about sex from the wrong sources: friends, books, or experience. Moralists and educators competed to frame sexuality as something sacred, dangerous, and always heterosexual. The adolescent was expected to know enough to behave, but not enough to ask questions. Class and the adolescent divide. Just as in childhood, adolescents split along class lines. Working-class adolescents left school earlier, often by 13 or 14. Took jobs in factories, mines, domestic service, or street trades. Had less parental supervision, especially if parents also worked. Were more likely to be criminalized for minor behavior. Social reformers saw these teens as both victims and threats. Programs like juvenile courts and reform schools emerged to discipline, correct, and mold them. Top-hat middle and upper-class adolescents remained in school longer, had tutors, governesses, or private education, participated in structured leisure, piano lessons, church groups, sports clubs, were protected from adult life for longer. But protection came at a cost: confinement, pressure, and surveillance. For all their privileges, these adolescents often felt isolated, trapped between expectations and inexperience. The birth of leisure time. For the first time in history, young people, especially in towns and cities, had something unprecedented: free time. Evenings and weekends not spent at work or school became social spaces, and new technologies helped fill them. Cinema, silent films offered thrills, fantasies, and romantic storylines far more daring than classroom lectures. Phonographs. Music could be bought, owned, and replayed, a private world of rhythm and lyrics. Bicycles gave teens personal mobility. Cheap novels. From boys' adventure tales to romantic weeklies for girls, stories could now be consumed in secret at speed. Leisure was no longer just for the wealthy. Adolescents across classes began to shape their own cultural tastes. Adults noticed and panicked. The reading crisis revisited. Books once again became a battleground. Young people reading on their own terms, especially girls, triggered new waves of concern. Romantic fiction, detective novels, even poetry were blamed for everything from early sexual behavior to social withdrawal. Girls' magazines, in particular, were attacked for promoting fantasy, vanity, and low moral tone. But despite the criticism, adolescent reading expanded. Libraries created teen sections. Publishers launched age-specific series. Book clubs sprang up in schools and community centers. By the 1930s, authors were writing for teenagers, though the term was still not widely used. Reading was no longer just a means to education. It had become a part of identity formation. The pushback, adolescents speak. Though adults did most of the talking, young people increasingly pushed back. In letters to editors, teens defended their tastes and asked for more nuanced stories. In school essays and diaries, they questioned the authority of teachers, parents, and religion. In poems and songs, they expressed longing, frustration, and hope. Some joined youth movements, not just scouts, but political organizations, labor groups, and suffrage leagues. In these spaces, adolescence was not just managed, it was mobilized. Adolescents weren't simply becoming adults, they were becoming themselves. The quiet emotional revolution. The most profound shift of all was emotional. Before adolescence had a name, most emotional development was framed in moral or religious terms. Feelings were things to control, suppress, or confess. But as adolescence became its own category, so too did emotional complexity. Crushes, friendship drama, spiritual doubt, and existential fear all were acknowledged, if not fully understood. Popular advice books began to appear, offering guidance on youth problems. Letters from lonely teens appeared in newspapers and church bulletins. The adolescent wasn't just a future adult, they were a person now, in the midst of inner transformation. Conclusion, a project still under construction. By the 1930s, adolescence had evolved from a vague idea into a concrete phase. Institutions were structured around it. Rules had been created for it. Fears had been projected onto it. Voices had begun to emerge from within it. But the category was still unsettled. Were adolescents children who hadn't grown up yet? Or were they individuals undergoing transformation? Should they be protected or empowered? Guided or given space? Feared or listened to? These questions would define the next chapter. As the 20th century progressed, adolescence, once merely a conceptual in-between, crystallized into a powerful cultural identity. By the mid-1900s, young people weren't just being shaped by society, they were starting to shape it in return. In this final section of Story 6, we trace the journey from the Victorian invention of adolescence to the full-fledged emergence of the teenager, a figure who would come to dominate modern advertising, fashion, education policy, and even political discourse. We'll explore how war, marketing, media, and rebellion fused to create a new kind of youth identity, and why adolescence, once barely acknowledged, became a cornerstone of modern life. Post-war Britain and the adolescent boom. The end of World War II marked a generational reset. Millions of young people had grown up in air raid shelters, evacuated from cities, with ration books and blackout curtains as part of their childhood. But the war's end brought not just peace, it brought prosperity. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a new pattern emerged. School leaving ages rose again, keeping adolescents in education until at least 15. Juvenile labor declined, replaced by apprenticeships and part-time work. Family incomes rose, leaving more pocket money in adolescent hands. Consumer goods became widely available even for the young. There were more teenagers than ever before, and they had money, free time, and a growing sense of themselves as a group. Adolescence was no longer a whisper, it was loud. The birth of the teenager. Though adolescence had been studied for decades, the word teenager didn't enter popular use until the 1940s. It first appeared in American advertising, then spread to Britain. Teenagers were portrayed as energetic, fickle, fashion-conscious, emotionally sensitive, distinct from both children and adults. Importantly, the teenager was not defined solely by biology but by culture. Music, clothes, slang, and even posture distinguished them. They didn't just grow up, they performed youth. The moral panic returns. Of course, this new visibility came with a price. Adults reacted with a familiar mix of concern and criticism. Newspapers lamented the decline of respect in teenage manners, sexual precocity in films and magazines, juvenile delinquency in post-war cities, the cult of idleness fueled by records and cinema. Sociologists studied the problem of youth. Police formed juvenile liaison units. Educators warned of a lost generation. But the teenage phenomenon was too big to suppress. Adolescents were not just being watched, they were watching back. Music, rebellion, and belonging. In the 1950s and 60s, the soundtrack of adolescence changed everything. Rock and roll arrived from the United States, wild, rhythmic, and driven by electric guitar. Skiffle, beat music, and later punk took hold in Britain. Radio stations, once formal and scripted, began catering to youth audiences. Music became a language for emotions, for rebellion, for connection. A boy could play a guitar instead of learning Latin. A girl could dance in jeans instead of sitting properly in a dress. A group of teenagers listening to the same band became a tribe. Suddenly, adolescence wasn't just biological, it was musical. Fashion and the teenage uniform. Before the 1950s, most adolescents wore the clothes their parents chose or school uniforms. But post-war Britain saw the rise of the youth fashion industry. Teddy boys donned Edwardian jackets, drainpipe trousers, and high collars. Mods embraced slim suits, parkas, and scooters. Rockers wore leather jackets, jeans, and motorcycle boots. Skinheads mixed working-class pride with aggressive style. Girls shortened skirts, teased their hair, and adopted makeup routines distinct from their mothers. Fashion was no longer a detail, it was a declaration. A teenage girl choosing lipstick over ribbons was making a statement. The body became a canvas of identity. Literature, TV, and the teenage reader. In the mid-20th century, publishing began to reflect the teenage experience. Novels like The Catcher in the Rye, though American, resonated globally, depicting adolescent alienation. British authors such as Susan Cooper, Robert Westall, and later Melvin Burgess wrote books that took teenage emotions seriously. New genres emerged: coming-of-age fiction, teen horror, high school romance. Meanwhile, television created youth-oriented programming. Top of the Pops for music lovers. Grange Hill for gritty school realism. Teen dramas that tackled everything from pregnancy to politics. The teenage audience no longer had to borrow adult stories. They had their own. School as a social world. By the 1960s and 70s, staying in school into the late teens became more common, even expected. This changed the social structure of adolescence. Teenagers formed peer groups and cliques. Romance, gossip, and rebellion happened in corridors and canteens. Exams and school uniforms became shared sources of stress and solidarity. In this context, school was no longer just a training ground. It was a culture with its own rituals, pressures, and hierarchies. And in the shadows of the schoolyard, identity was tested daily. Advertising discovers youth. Marketers quickly realized teenagers had one crucial trait: desire. They might not own property, but they wanted things. Records, clothes, magazines, sweets, bicycles, makeup, gadgets. Brands began targeting them directly. Be yourself. Don't be like your parents. This is the sound of youth. Every girl wants. Real men wear. Youth became a market, and with it, adolescence became a commodity. Families redefined themselves. As adolescents gained cultural and economic clout, family life changed. Parents negotiated rather than dictated. Bedrooms became private domains, decorated with posters and filled with music. Dinner table debates replaced lectures. Curfews were negotiated, not assumed. But the conflicts remained. Should a girl wear trousers to church? Should a boy grow his hair long? Should a teen be allowed to date, dance, read, or rebel? For every family, adolescence was both a mirror and a magnifying glass reflecting changes, amplifying tensions. Policy protest and the political teen. In the 1960s and 70s, adolescents became politically active, not just symbols, but agents. School walkouts occurred over curriculum, corporal punishment, or outdated facilities. Youth wings of political parties flourished. Music and fashion carried anti-war, anti-nuclear, and anti-racist messages. Adolescents were no longer waiting to inherit the world. They were trying to reshape it. Even their silences, refusing to salute, declining to vote, dropping out, became forms of protest. The teenager's inner world. What remained beneath the culture was the experience of adolescence itself. In the pages of diaries, notebooks, and school essays, young people continued to write. I feel things too much. No one understands me. I want to be different. I want to disappear. I want to change everything. Despite decades of observation, science, control, and marketing, adolescence remained at its core a time of intense interiority. The legacy of Victorian invention. What began in the Victorian age as a subtle shift, a delay in labor, a focus on school, a new kind of child had, by the late 20th century, become a social epic. The invention of adolescence gave rise to youth rights, teen subcultures, student activism, psychological support structures, a distinct, recognized voice in media and society. But it also gave rise to new anxieties, endless marketing, cultural stereotyping, a prolonged dependency on adult structures. Adolescence was both a freedom and a framework, an identity to claim and a category to outgrow. The final thought. So what is adolescence really? Is it a stage of life? A cultural performance? A product of capitalism? A biological inevitability? A modern myth? Perhaps it's all of these. But at its quietest, most honest moment, adolescence is this: a space between childhood and adulthood, where the self first takes shape, not fully formed, but vividly imagined. And in that fragile imagining, half rebellion, half longing, the modern individual is born. Story 7. Servants, nannies, and nursemaids, the people who raised Victorian children. When we imagine a Victorian childhood, our minds often conjure cradles, pinafores, wooden toys, and perhaps a strict schoolroom. But rarely do we picture the adults who made these scenes possible, not the parents, but the servants. The women and occasionally men who dressed the children, fed them, walked them through foggy parks, and whispered lullabies in upstairs nurseries. This is the story of those forgotten caregivers, the nannies, nursemaids, governesses, and domestic staff who, for decades, were the real architects of British childhood. The domestic machine. Victorian households, especially those of the middle and upper classes, ran on a complex domestic system. Even modest families employed at least one servant. Larger households had entire hierarchies: butlers, housemaids, cooks, footmen, and laundresses. But for families with children, one role mattered above all others: the nurse. There were levels to this. Nurse or nanny, the primary caregiver for infants and young children, often older and more experienced. Nursemaid, a junior assistant to the nanny, typically in her teens or early 20s. Governess, responsible for the child's education, usually after age 5 or 6, often educated, genteel, and socially isolated. Wet nurse, employed to breastfeed infants when mothers could not or would not. These women were expected to be patient, loyal, invisible, and devoted not just to their employers, but to their employers' children. The Great Divide, motherhood and class. In elite and upper-middle-class families, mothers were often not the primary caregivers. Victorian ideals of femininity emphasized purity, refinement, and delicacy, traits not easily squared with sleepless nights, dirty diapers, or loud tantrums. For many, the nursery was a separate kingdom, one that the lady of the house might visit daily, but not rule. This wasn't necessarily coldness. Rather, it was a structured delegation of care. Mothers provided moral guidance and final decisions. Servants provided emotional labor and daily presence. And children, especially in their early years, often bonded more deeply with their nannies than their parents. Life in the nursery. The nursery was a self-contained world, usually on the top floor of a townhouse or in the back of a large country estate. It had a day nursery for meals and play, a night nursery with beds or cribs, adjoining quarters for the nanny or nursemaid. The children lived here, full-time away from adult company. They ate separately, rose early, and followed a strict schedule of walks, lessons, and rest. Visitors, especially fathers, were limited. Some children saw their parents only briefly each day, if at all. In this cloistered space, nursemaids were the center of the child's world. The nanny's role. To be a Victorian nanny was to live a life of contradictions. She was trusted to raise the family's children, but rarely invited to family dinners. She might sleep just feet from her charges, but remained below stairs in the social hierarchy. She knew her employer's secrets, tempers, and habits, but was expected to remain silent. Her work began at dawn and often ended after bedtime. Dressing and undressing, bathing, feeding, and for infants, sometimes breastfeeding, comforting during illness or teething, supervising play, managing junior nursery staff. She was not a mother, nor a servant in the traditional sense. She was something between a surrogate, a caretaker, and often a ghost in the family home. From love to labor. Many nannies became emotionally attached to their charges. In letters and journals, former nannies describe crying when children left for boarding school, resentment when replaced by new governesses, grief when a child died, sometimes more deeply felt than by the distant parent. But this affection was complicated by power and precarity. Nannies could be dismissed without notice. They had no legal protections. A child's misbehavior or illness could be blamed on neglect in the nursery. One nanny wrote in 1883, "When the baby took ill, I was up 3 nights straight. But when the doctor came, it was the mistress who took credit for noticing his fever." Another recalled, "I raised 4 of them, but when the eldest married, I was not invited. Only the family sat in the front rows." The nursemaid's lot. If the nanny was halfway to family, the nursemaid was barely above the scullery maid. These young women, often aged 14 to 20, did the grunt work, hauling bathwater, cleaning chamber pots, ironing tiny clothes, pushing prams for miles through soot-filled streets, standing silent during family portraits. They were expected to be cheerful, clean, modest, and completely without ambition. Their wages were low and their room, often shared with other maids, barely heated. But for some, it was a stepping stone, a chance to learn, earn, and perhaps rise to the coveted position of nanny. The governess, alone in the drawing room. If the nanny belonged to the nursery, the governess was a ghost in the drawing room. Educated, unmarried, and usually from a fallen middle-class background, the governess was hired to teach children, particularly girls, subjects like reading and writing, French or German, music, sewing, and etiquette. She was not a servant, but not quite family either. She dined alone, spent evenings in solitude, and was often desperately lonely. Fictional governesses like Jane Eyre reflect this tension. Real ones wrote letters filled with frustration and longing. One wrote in 1871, "They say I am not one of the maids, but neither am I a lady. I float between stairs like a shadow." Wet nurses and the intimate stranger. In some households, particularly aristocratic ones, wet nurses were employed to breastfeed infants. These women were usually from rural backgrounds and lived in the nursery during the child's first months. The Victorian upper classes often viewed breastfeeding as unseemly, for ladies especially if they were to return quickly to social duties. Wet nurses were chosen for good health and diet, moral character as judged by employers, ample milk supply. They were essential, yet almost always dismissed once the child weaned. Few formed lasting bonds. Some were forbidden to see their own bobbies while serving wealthy households. It was the ultimate paradox, giving literal nourishment but treated as emotionally disposable. Servants in working-class homes. Not all Victorians had grand nurseries. Among the working classes, older siblings often raised the young, but even modest middle-class families might employ